received. Gemma, you've got Militia. You're due to leave
No,
early?
I'm not. It's just in case.
Just in case. Okay, thanks. And no others?
Nope.
Okay. Declaration of interest. Members are obliged to declare any relevant financial or interest at each committee meeting as applicable. There's an item of correspondence. I think it's in item 1310. It's about Omicron hospitality payments. It is a business in my constituency, so I'm therefore making a relevant declaration. Move on to the next item on the agenda, funding for the North West 200 and the Ulster Grand Prix, the chairperson's business. I've been made aware of a funding uncertainty associated with the organisation of the North West 200 and the Ulster Grand Prix. I was given to understand that around about £780,000 to £800,000 of support from the Department of Economy was promised, and this was subject to sign-off by the Department of Finance. Obviously, because the Ulster Grand Prix is fairly close, and I think it's less than 100 days for them to get everything in place, they're concerned that, having been told, I think, by Tourism or Northern Ireland Tourism NI and also the Department of Economy, that this money was becoming available. They've now been told it's been held up by the Department of Finance. The reason why I think it's of interest to the Department of Finance is because I think we've been briefed beforehand that ministers have up to, I think it's about £1 million that they should be able to allocate without necessarily resort to the Minister for Finance. So I'm a bit concerned about this because obviously, and I think obviously my friend from North Antrim will be quite clear on this one, the importance of both the Ulster Grand Prix and indeed the North West and the funding to these as well. I'd just like the committee's approval to write to the Minister and also to the Minister of the Economy and the Minister of Finance, and also if we could info the Committee for the Economy and find out what the reason for this hold-up of this funding is, because I understand if they don't get the funding fairly soon, they're in a situation where they might have to cancel the event, which I don't think any of us would wish to see. Any comments? Jim?
Is this new or additional funding? Because they do get source funding.
I think this is new funding.
Actually, could I just check? Sorry, I'm loading my pack up. Is this money that has been, are we by extension advocating, I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm just asking, are we by advocating that an additional allocation be made to the Ulster Grand Prix, or are we saying release funds that have already been allocated?
I think the question is just asking where the money is, because I understand it has already been allocated. They just haven't got it. And the excuse that's been, or the reason that's been given, and I can't use the word excuse, the reason that's been given is because it's been held up by the Department of Finance. So I'm just...
But that sounds like it's some sort of special allocation that needs...
Yeah. So I think I would sort of like to get some clarity on it.
Okay, no objection to that.
Yeah, I have no objection.
Okay. Agreed? Next, estimates memorandum. The Department has unexpectedly shared an estimates memorandum for the Department of Finance. The committee had asked the Department to develop these in order to assist members in their understanding of the estimates, and we must congratulate the Department for so doing. Is the committee therefore content for me to write to the other statutory committees asking them if they have received an estimates memorandum for their own areas and seeking their views on how this might be improved, as well as their views on the Department's spending on 21-22?
Not agreed.
That's agreed. Okay. Moving on to the draft minutes of proceeding. The draft minutes of the Finance Committee on the 26th of January at page 6. Are members content that the draft minutes of the 26th of January are an accurate record of proceedings? Are we agreed? Agreed. There are no matters arising. Agreed. Moving on to the next item, we'll take the team out, is Rachel, Chris and Eileen there?
I think it's just Rachel, actually. So.
Rachel, are you there?
Hello, yes I am.
Hi Rachel, good to see you again. Team, item number 6 on the agenda, the Public Finance Scrutiny Unit COVID spending. We're now receiving an oral briefing from our great friends in RAISE, and the RAISE paper on COVID spending is on page 3 of the tabled paper. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. I'm going to go through the RAISE briefing paper entitled COVID-19 Funding Allocations and Spending in Northern Ireland, which starts on page 3 of your packs. The paper explains how and when COVID-19 funding was received by the Executive from Central Government and then allocated and spent at the departmental level in Northern Ireland over the course of the financial year 2020-21. Throughout the paper, a number of potential issues for consideration are also highlighted using the blue boxes. So turning first to section 1 on page 4 of your packs, which outlines the Executive's strategic priorities in relation to its COVID-19 response. Throughout the pandemic, there's been a focus on the health service and ensuring that the health service is supported. This focus impacted executive decision making in terms of when making decisions on restrictions, many of which were put in place to ensure the health service was not overstretched, as well as making decisions on where best to allocate its COVID-19 funding. Outside of that, the executive strategic approach to the pandemic fell into 2 distinct phases. The first was the response phase, followed by the recovery phase. So during the response phase, there was a focus on maintaining key public services, protecting vulnerable people and supporting businesses. During the recovery phase, as well as maintaining key public services and protecting people, there was a push to support economic recovery. So turning to figure 2 on page 7 of your packs, figure 2 shows the timeline of COVID-19 funding allocations made to the Executive by the UK Government throughout the 2020-21 financial year. It's important to note that the funding was allocated unevenly throughout the year, with some allocations occurring very near to the end of the financial year. The Executive received more than $3 billion in additional funding over the course of the year. It's also worth pointing out that all of that funding received right up until the 24th of December 2020 ultimately had to be used within that financial year. The additional Barnett consequential of approximately $300 million received in February of 2021 was able to be carried over into the following financial year. The Department of Finance was responsible for allocating this funding to each of the executive departments, and this was done outside of the normal financial processes of budget and in-year monitoring exercises. Instead, the funding was allocated to departments throughout the financial year through a series of exercises. These allocations were then communicated via ministerial statements. There were 15 of these in total throughout the year, and these are provided in figure 3 on page 8. At the start of the year, the bidding process was similar to that used during normal monitoring rounds. So essentially, departments submitted bids for COVID funding, the Department of Finance made an initial assessment of the information received, and then the Finance Minister proposed recommendations to the Executive, which then made a final decision. There were times throughout the year where departments made specific requests for funding, or where funding for a specific issue was agreed at the Executive level, and the department, and this went through just a single paper. Towards the latter end of the financial year, the process was not confined to a set period to make bids. It was a more ad hoc process, and departments were encouraged to come forward with proposals as and when they became sufficiently developed. Those proposals were then collated and brought to the Executive for a decision at appropriate times. Departments were also asked to rank the bids submitted in order of importance, and the Executive's overarching strategic priorities were used during decision making. As is normal practice, departments submitted a number of reduced requirements throughout the year. These are provided in figure 4 on page 11, and I'll discuss the relevance of some of these during the analysis section of the paper. Over the course of the year, the Department of Finance received 252 bids with a combined total value of $3.8 billion. Figure 5 on page 12 shows the number of bids submitted by each of the departments and their associated total value. So the Department of Education submitted 68 bids, which was the highest number of bids submitted by any of the departments, and these bids had a combined total value of $322 million. In contrast, the Department of Health submitted only 18 bids, totaling more than $1.3 billion. Bids could either be met in full, i.e. they were successful, be met in part, i.e. they were partially successful, or unsuccessful and received no allocation. The tables in the appendix include all of the bids submitted during the financial year 2020-21, broken down by department, and they're colour coordinated to aid the reader, so successful bids are green, partially successful bids are yellow, and unsuccessful bids are red. Figures 6 and 7 on page 12 and 13 show how successful each of the departments were throughout the bidding process. So figure 5 shows the percentage of funding allocated as a proportion of total bids submitted by each of the departments. The Department of Finance was the most successful, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs was the least successful. Figure 7 shows the percentage of successful, partially successful and unsuccessful bids by department, and the ordering for this is fairly consistent with the ordering for the overall value of successful bids, again with the Department of Finance at the top, followed by the Department for Economy and the Department of Health.
Just a quick one, Rachel. So, see the Department for Economy's figure there, and I think if you go to, I think it's figure. Let me check. Is it figure 4 on reduced requirements? So basically, the Department for Economy bid significantly, was allocated significantly, and then handed it all back.
A large proportion of that was for the High Street voucher scheme. That was 93, a reduced requirement of 93 million.
Right.
But they did submit sort of the highest number of reduced requirements throughout the year.
Yeah, because if you look at figure 4, the one thing that really stands out, and then you would look at that and you would say, okay, there's something fundamentally wrong about sort of how the bid process was, but actually they were allocated sort of successful. Just looking at your very informative graphic, they were successful and partially successful up to sort of 93% of the time of what they asked for. You just didn't spend it.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct. But as I said, a large proportion of that was to do with one scheme, which was the High Street voucher scheme, and I think the Minister made a couple of statements on that in response to questions asked.
Okay, thanks, Rachel.
Okay. Section 2 of the paper looks at the actual expenditure of each of the departments, and it takes each of those in turn. It's important to note that a significant portion of COVID-19 expenditure in Northern Ireland has taken in the form of grant payments. So the Audit Office did some work on these grant payments. They estimated that over 1 billion of expenditure during the financial year 2020-21 was spent on grants. Many of these schemes were designed and delivered at pace, and in some instances by departments which do not ordinarily administer grant funding. For this reason, it's likely that grant schemes designed and delivered during the pandemic may include fraudulent or erroneous payments. As part of this research, we contacted the departments responsible for administering such schemes, requesting information on fraudulent or erroneous payments that they have made and if they've been able to recover those payments. At the time of writing, replies were not received from all of those departments, so we don't have all of that information available. Section 2, the analysis starts with the Department for Infrastructure. In 2.2.1 on page 15. So the majority of the Department for Infrastructure's COVID funding was used to cover the loss of income. So that was in like TransLink and Northern Ireland Water and things like that. They did administer one grant funding scheme, and that was for the taxi, bus and coach sector. They submitted 41 bids in total, and of those 41 bids, 17 were successful and 6 were partially successful. A breakdown of all of the bids and allocations is shown in Table 1 of the appendix. However, it's worth pointing out...
Just a quick one, and you've raised a really good point there about sort of scrutiny and sort of the A6. So non-COVID reduced requirement was 6.8 million, but in the COVID bid, A6 flagship 14.8 million.
I guess the point regarding that thing was originally it was a non-COVID bid submitted earlier on in the year, and a non-COVID allocation, and then a non-COVID reduced requirement. But then later on in the year, it became a COVID bid. So one of my potential scrutiny areas was to sort of ask the department, how that was communicated throughout the year and when that was communicated throughout the year. It's not typical across all of the departments that this happened. The Department for Infrastructure, I think, got most of the capital COVID funding. The Department of Health also received capital COVID funding, but there was a point during the year where the Department for Infrastructure received 2 capital COVID grants. And the Finance Minister, I think I've quoted him there on page 17, recognising the importance of capital projects to stimulate our economic recovery. The 2 allocations were made then to the Department for Infrastructure.
I mean, it just seems strange because, particularly with the A6 and sort of the timing of that, the ability to switch on a tap to give 14.8 million for a particular contract for that at the A6 at the time, it does stand out. You're quite right. It is a potential scrutiny point that we should be asking the question about.
And there was another instance then of that non-COVID funding. It's not entirely clear, but there was a bid submission in September for COVID funding for roads winter service. But earlier on in the year there had been 2 non-COVID bids. They were both unsuccessful, but there was a non-COVID bid for 4 million and a non-COVID bid for 3 million. So again, they went from non-COVID to COVID if they covered the same thing, and we didn't get a response from the department on that. So it's a potential point for scrutiny.
I think the other, I don't know, but again, what did you pick up in Northern Ireland Water? Because we understand, I think it was today at the Infrastructure Committee, they were being briefed that Northern Ireland Water nearly had severe financial problems. So you would have thought through the part of the COVID process there would have been some signalling of that, but there doesn't seem to be here.
I think there was just one allocation to Northern Ireland Water, and again it was to sort of start, under the guise of economic recovery. It was a capital allocation for around 15 million, I think.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Yep.
So moving on to the Department of Finance, obviously they had the highest success rate in terms of bids, but it's sort of an internal programme, so it's not really very reflective. But they submitted 12 bids for 430 million, and all of those were successful. They oversaw basically 7 distinct COVID-related initiatives. They reported an overall underspend of 44 million, which was the highest underspend of any of the departments. But this was in relation to 3 schemes that were designed and implemented very late in the year. So I think around the March 15th to March 25th, these 3 schemes were implemented. The Finance Minister had referred to them a couple of times throughout statements, saying that this was the contingency plan, and then the reason for the underspend was noted as despite promotion of both of the schemes and then subsequent extension of their application, they just had a lower than expected uptake. And that was in relation to the NAV scheme, Small Business Top-Up Grants. The third scheme, there seemed to be some crossover between eligible businesses and businesses that had already received funding from other schemes. So the overall pool of eligible businesses was lower than they thought. So that was the reason for the underspend.
Okay, thanks.
So just moving on to the Department for Health, they submitted 13 bids, totaling 1.3 billion. It was the highest value of bids, and they also received the highest allocation. 3 of their bids were successful, and 9 were successful, and 3 were partially successful. It's worth noting that the Department of Health does have these additional flexibilities in terms of resource style, and they've had that for a number of years, and it's in the in-year monitoring guidance. It's not clear if that actually was included within COVID funding, because COVID funding was a separate exercise, but it is resource style, so it's not clear, and that's one of my potential scrutiny points for the Department of Finance. It's also worth noting that they also submitted a reduced requirement of 90 million throughout the year. The Minister of Health did answer an Assembly question on that and said that it was the 90 million was reduced in January, or returned in January, due to forecast reductions undertaken to do with annual leave and PPE. And then moving on to the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, they submitted 7 bids for COVID funding that totaled just over 200 million. 2 were successful and 2 were partially successful, but the resultant allocation was only 41 million, so that's quite a big variance. The bids are also available in Table 4 of the appendix, but the large variance between the overall bid value and then the overall allocation value referred to sort of one area. They submitted a large bid of 107 million between April and May, so that was the first COVID exercise for the agri-food sector market. That bid was partially successful, and they received a 25 million allocation. A second bid entitled Market Support was entered during the June monitoring round for the amount of 81.5 million, and they stated at this time that it was just a marker bid. But there was no further bid. That bid was unsuccessful, and there was no further bids made throughout the year. So it's not clear whether that estimation was just high, or they were able to reallocate internal funds. So moving on to the Department of Justice, they submitted 14 bids, totaling just over 50 million. Of those 14 bids, 3 were successful and 6 were partially successful, and this resulted in an overall allocation of 25.9 million. The majority of the Department of Justice COVID funding is directed towards supporting the police service, the Northern Ireland Prison Service and the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service, just to do with maintaining critical services. They did report a number of reduced requirements throughout the financial year, resulting in a return of approximately 7.6 million. And some of this was done quite late in the year. I think one of the allocations for 1 million was reported sort of near the end of March. So although they don't have an underspend, when we talk about a yearly underspend, it can be. We also have to look at when the reduced requirements as well, because if you submit a reduced requirement, you don't have an underspend. But if you're submitting a reduced requirement sort of late in the year, it's very hard for that funding to be reallocated elsewhere. It is worth noting that in their annual report and accounts, quite a large proportion of their own budget was reallocated towards COVID matters.
Yeah, it is notable, because when you say with the DOJ, you said approximately 7.6 million was returned to the executive for reallocation in year. Yeah, we've heard from the Policing Board and various other places, the shortage of funds for PSNI even in year for doing things. Yet £7.6 million has gone back. So there seems to be a disconnect from what was the requirement for policing and other elements of sort of within justice. Yet they handed money back. Just seems quite unusual.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And that Project Dignity was obviously the sort of the morgue facility that thankfully wasn't needed.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah.
Moving on to the Executive Office. So the Executive Office submitted 7 bids, totaling 14.4 million. Of those, 2 were successful and 1 was partially successful, resulting in a total funding allocation of 4.8 million. This was mainly to do for public relations and public information, but they did run one grant scheme for travel agents. This resulted in a ministerial direction being issued. Grant schemes are more risk. There's more risk involved than and not enough time to do all the normal checks. So there was a ministerial statement released for that. We asked them for information on any fraudulent or erroneous payments, and we didn't receive a response from that at the time of writing. It was for a fairly small amount. It was for around 1 million, I think. So moving on to the Department for Education, they submitted 65 bids. This was the highest number of bids. The bids were obviously smaller than some of the other departments, and they were for quite specific things. The bids totaled 322 million. 32 of them were successful, 11 were partially successful, and the resulting allocation was 213 million. So they sort of split up their response into 2 areas: the response to the pandemic at the start, and then the restart program, which was to get the school set up for children returning to school. So they also submitted a number of reduced requirements throughout the year, resulting in a return of approximately 54.1 million. The reason I'm saying approximately was because the value in the bidding information that we received and the value in the sort of in-year monitoring documents are both different, and they also differ from the value that the Minister said in response to a question. She said it was 52.6 million, so not a significant difference, but a difference nonetheless. And it was noted that 19.7 million was surrendered as a reduced requirement on the 25th of February 2020, and then a further 8 million was surrendered on the 25th. Sorry, that should be the 25th of February 2021 and the 25th of March 2021. So that's sort of near the end of the financial year. Despite the reduced requirement, in the annual report they report an underspend of 7 million towards COVID their COVID response, but I don't believe this is actually COVID money. This is money that had been reallocated within their budget towards their COVID response, but they have stated in the annual report that 3 million was, there was an underspend of 3 million to do with their contingency funding for COVID, and then an underspend of 4 million for childcare related COVID money. Moving on to the Department for Economy. The Department for Economy submitted 46 bids totaling 475 million. 36 of these were successful and 6 were partially successful, so their overall allocation was 439 million. They oversaw 25 distinct related initiatives, COVID related initiatives. A large proportion of this was to do with supporting businesses throughout the pandemic. So we have some figures of their overpayments. I think this was reported to the committee in November, so you've probably seen some of these numbers before. But for example, the overpayment to do with the small business support was 2.3%, which was the highest overpayment among the schemes. But Figure 11 lists out the different schemes that they offered and overpayments that were made in relation to those schemes. It's interesting to point out the Audit Office produced a report on the small business scheme, and that report is available, and it looks at sort of lessons learned in sort of design and implication of a scheme during the pandemic. It's also worth pointing out that we verified a lot of the information with the annual report and accounts for each of the departments, but the Department for Economy's annual report and account is the only one that wasn't available at the time of writing. And the Auditor General has said that there's a report in that from the Northern Ireland Audit Office to do with those schemes. So it seems that a lot of our questions will be answered by reading that report, but it wasn't available at the time of writing.
Okay, thanks, Rachel.
And finally, moving on to the Board for Communities, they submitted 38 bids for COVID-19 funding, totaling 404 million. Ultimately, 15 were successful and 10 were partially successful, which resulted in a total funding allocation of 256 million. They oversaw 24 distinct areas. And the Northern Ireland Audit Office looked at one of these areas, which was the Sports Sustainability Fund. This was the scheme designed to help the sports sector deal with the financial impact of COVID. That report highlighted a number of issues relating to the design of the scheme, and that again was to do with lessons learned through design of a scheme. The Northern Ireland Audit Office looked at other schemes that they'd ran as well, though they did state that their staff had looked at those schemes as well as the sports scheme, and said that they seemed on face value that everything was sort of paid in lines with the rules of the schemes, so they didn't believe that there was a large amount of overpayments or fraudulent payments made through that scheme. We did ask them for additional information, but it wasn't available at the time of writing. So that's sort of everything from me. If you do have any additional questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Rachel, as usual, an excellent piece of work by Reyes. Any members wish to ask any questions? Oh, stunned into, it's not quite like our committee. Just a quick one. Can we circulate that to the other committees? Yep.
That's agreed.
Committee, can we circulate this to other committees, because I think this is an excellent piece of work.
Agreed.
And could we also arrange for copies in the library as well?
I think that they automatically appear on the website as Reyes publishes everything, and it's on their blog too. So I think that's where we usually go. I think Keith has a question.
Sorry, go ahead, Keith. Sorry, didn't see you. Keith.
Pardon? Keith has crashed. We'll talk among ourselves, members. If we
yeah.
And the other member has a question, Chairperson. I'll see if he's...
Any other members? Rachel, as usual, your excellent degree of research has stunned the committee. But I say that is very useful and very valuable. Okay. Rachel, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed for your time. And please pass our thanks on to the rest of the team. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay. Thank you. So, Tim, just to get that formally agreed, we circulate the.
There he is. If you ask Keith what his question is, I could write to you.
Keith, sort of apologies. You dropped off the link. So I've just said Rachel could go, but we can write to her if you want to send us what your question was.
Hold on, put him into the spotlight. Can you put him in the spotlight, Stephen?
Yep.
Yeah, hold on, technical problem. Sorry, bear with us, Keith, if you would. Oh, sorry, Stephen, have we crashed? Or can you put Keith into the spotlight?
You know what this is?
Pardon?
It's because they've got the spotlight on the
No.
across the assembly as well.
Oh, right, sorry. Okay, sorry, members, if we could just take a break for a second. Stephen's PC has crashed. That's the PC that crashed, not Keith. So
Okay.
do you want to push the button for a second, and we'll members take their ease?
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly.
1440. And
What does Keith? Does Keith have a question?
hi, Keith, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. You hear me?
Yeah, you did. Did you have a question for the interruption?
Well, it's a sort of a broad question. She may not have the answer in front of her, so it may warrant contacting her. Chair, it's regarding the COVID spend, the 3 billion we got from Westminster to here. How did we perform in comparison to other devolved areas? You know, obviously not all that 3 billion was spent. Some of that was put back and is still going to be, you know, transferred. But how we performed against other areas, devolved areas.
Okay, Keith. Well, we'll ask the question of Rachel and the Raise team, and then we'll get our response back to you.
And one second question, which is just a question of interest in respect to that paper. Very good paper. But what person errors is there in producing that paper? I'd like to know, just for my own interest.
Sorry, what was that? I didn't quite hear that, Keith.
What's to do with the
How
person?
many person hours is there in producing that paper?
Oh, person hours. Oh, full-time equivalent. All right. Okay.
Manner, but I'm just being politically correct.
Ooh. Okay. Thanks, team. Okay, let's move on to the next item on the agenda, number 7. This is a briefing on the Procurement Board update from the Department of Finance. We will now receive an oral briefing from the Department of Finance officials giving a Procurement Board update. And in person, have we got Sharon and Michael?
They're just coming in.
Yep. Hi, Sharon.
Hello,
Hi, Michael. Come on in. Sorry, we had a bit of a IT kerfuffle there, so I think we're back up and running, so everything should be running smoothly. Team, this is our brief on the sort of Procurement Board. The Clerk's brief is page 21. The Department of Finance Procurement Board update in terms of reference page 30. Procurement Reform Bill update from the Minister of Finance is page 42. Correspondence in relation to public sector procurement contracts at page 49 of the meeting packs, and the departmental response at page 43 is in tabled items. I just need to check on that one. Information on the public procurement common framework is on page 52. Okay, team, you're both very welcome. Who's doing the speaking? Is that you, Sharon?
That's me, Chair.
Over
yes.
to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to update the committee today on the work of the Procurement Board, the Procurement Reform Bill and the Common Framework for Public Procurement. I'll provide the opening remarks on the Procurement Board and the Reform Bill, and then I'm going to pass over to Michael, if that's okay, to update you on the Common Framework. Firstly, in terms of the Procurement Board, since its restructuring in December 2020, the Procurement Board has met 7 times. The most recent meeting of the Board was this morning. The terms of reference and minutes for the Procurement Board are available on the DOF website. In setting up the new Procurement Board, the Minister agreed a new approach to developing procurement policy, which is now approved by the Executive and published on the DOF website in the form of procurement policy notes. The Procurement Board agreed a forward work programme in April 2021. The work programme has allowed the following procurement policy notes to be developed and approved by the Executive, and there are 5 procurement policy notes. So that's scoring social value, procurement of social and other specific services, supply chain resilience, procurement control limits and human rights in public procurement. Further detail on each policy has been provided in the written brief, which was sent a few weeks ago to the committee. So in the interest of time, I intend to provide only a high-level summary of the policies.
Yes, please.
The policy on scoring social value was published on the 5th of July 2021. It prioritises the need to use public procurement to develop social, economic and environmental objectives by mandating that tenders from the 1st of June 2022 must include a minimum of 10% of the total award criteria to score social value. This will apply to service contracts valued over $122,000 and construction contracts valued over $4.7 million. This aligns with the threshold set in the Public Contracts Regulations. From June 2022, new tenders will require contractors to pay staff the living wage. Training on how to score social value has been developed and is available for procurement staff, departments and suppliers. The mandating of scoring of social value is a significant statement indicating clearly the importance of the Executive attaches to delivering social value from its procurement spend. While scoring is mandated from this June, some measures were implemented in September 2021, where all government contracts were required to include measures to support fair work practices and ensure government contractors comply with relevant employment equality and maintain human rights standards. And in support of the scoring social value policy, the next policy that the Executive approved was on the procurement of social and other specific services, which was published on the 22nd of November 2021. It aims to achieve improved outcomes for community and social services. The policy outlines the flexibilities that exist when procuring these people-centric services, whether above or below the procurement threshold. The policy asks for engagement to be carried out with service providers pre-tender. It also outlines the process for reserving contracts for organisations in the voluntary, community and social enterprise sector and encourages engagement with local communities and end users. This policy was co-designed by the Procurement Board and a subgroup with the Education Authority, Health Sector as well as the Social Economy Sector, as these are the areas most impacted by the new policy. The next policy was the Policy on Supply Chain Resilience, which was published in November 2021. The COVID pandemic triggered a global shortage of PPE and other essential supplies and showed that over-reliance on long supply chains for critical supplies brought with it significant risks. A stronger focus on security of supply was deemed necessary to avoid the issues experienced at the outset of the pandemic. This policy requires departments to assess supply chain risk for critical supplies and put in place actions to mitigate those risks. The policy also encourages the shortening of supply chains, which in itself should stimulate local markets for critical items. In addition to developing new policies, the Forward Work Programme also had one of its priorities was the review of the existing guidance notes and to take any policies that remained in the guidance note and elevate those into procurement policy. This piece of work led to 2 pieces of policy being brought forward to the Executive in September 2021, and that was the policy on procurement control limits, which is designed to ensure that public procurement policy stimulates effective competition whilst achieving a balance between the value of the contract and the transactional costs of undertaking the procurement process. And the second one was the human rights in public procurement, which mandates the actions Department must take to incorporate human rights considerations into contracts when conducting a procurement process. At today's Procurement Board meeting, 2 further policy notes were endorsed and will be forwarded to the Executive for approval. These policies, which were previously embedded in construction procurement notes, will introduce a standard form of contract for public sector construction contracts, including the appropriate balance of risk and a policy on the transparency of construction pipeline, which will, if endorsed by the Executive, require departments to publish accurate information relating to their infrastructure investments.
Sorry, just going back to that one. Obviously, and we'll come to this in questions, but obviously there's some significant issues to question about, what are we doing about improving public sector procurement? Because it's great hearing of all these policies and papers and all the rest of it, but what has actually changed and have things got better? But just to go back to what you just told me there, is that about risk with the contractor, risk with the department, how that's been done and how that's been analysed? What does that actually mean?
It's about the risk apportion, so how we apportion risk between the contracting authority and the supplier. And there has been criticism, and this has, the collapse of Carillion in 2018 showed that there was no recognition of how risk was allocated, particularly in infrastructure projects. So this is about making sure that the appropriate clauses are used to have the risk sitting with the body that's most able to manage those risks. So, for example, you shouldn't outsource risk to the private sector that only the public sector can manage. And all of the clauses in the construction contract and the standard form of contract will show, and we saw evidence of this with the material costs, where there weren't specific clauses that could have been used that are now proposed to be used, and this actually mandates the use. So changes, the contractor and the supplier will work together through those changes to make sure that all of that risk does not sit with the contractor. And
just to expand slightly on that, because obviously, is this across all public sector and local government procurement, or is this just particularly Northern Ireland civil service?
It's departments and their arm's length bodies where Northern Ireland public procurement applies, so it doesn't apply to local government, but it will apply to infrastructure, NI Water, Translink, health, education, housing executive.
Not to the universities, even though one particular university has had enormous amounts of financial transaction capital and the rest of it that's gone in its general direction.
It will depend if they're grant funded, because the Department for Economy looks after universities, can by condition of grant make Northern Ireland public procurement policy apply, which they generally do.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. It was just that bit that you mentioned that it sort of just. Yep.
Another important issue for the Procurement Board was to improve commercial focus. It's been acknowledged that there are a number of strategic drivers that require transformation in public procurement governance structures and policy priorities, requiring a shift in focus away from process-driven function to a commercial enabler, which will help deliver government commitments. In recognising this and the need to provide a more commercial focus for public procurement, the Procurement Board was asked to consider adoption of practices set out in the Cabinet Office's sourcing and construction playbooks. The sourcing toolkit was brought to the Procurement Board today, and it will come back to the Procurement Board for its last meeting in March, where it hopefully will be endorsed. And the construction toolkit is under development, and it's hoped that that will be available by April of this year.
Obviously, one of the issues we have with, and I think it might come up in questions, but I'll sort of get out there now, is previously when we were talking about sort of a most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender in that process as well. But obviously, one of the what I think I don't know if the paper's out yet today, but one of the things that was in the Levelling Up Fund or the Levelling Up process was the fact that there'd be priority given to local sort of contractors for up to a certain level and the rest of it when it comes to looking for public service procurement. But we don't have that because of the Northern Ireland Protocol, because we still have to, in many respects, rely on sort of EU procurement rules. Was that looked at today in that particular area?
The EU procurement rules don't apply in Northern Ireland. We're following the public contracts regulations, and below threshold, the policies are meant to improve more flexibilities. The only change really with the protocol is that there's a specification for goods that come into Northern Ireland that we have to comply with, and also about advertising, which we would do anyway for all our contracts above the value of £30,000.
Wasn't there a recent report in the House of Lords that talked specifically about where we were looking at the sort of the regulations and the way various EU regulations were being applied? That meant that, where we say things to do service and contracts didn't apply to the protocol, they actually said that they did apply because of the protocol, and particularly to do with that. Have you seen any of that, or is it can you categorically state that when we come to public procurement, we will be able to follow the sort of the UK route and will not be bound by EU rules and regulations?
So we'll come on to the Procurement Reform Bill, but certainly the public contracts regulations applies here as it does England, Wales and Scotland. And we are working with the Cabinet Office, and it has been agreed by the Executive that we will come in under the Procurement Reform Bill, which will go through Parliament in the spring, summer of this year. So there's no interference with our procurement rules because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. As I say, it relates to goods. So when we're buying goods even below the European threshold, it's about making sure that we don't specify something that is a particular standard that's not EU-wide. That's my understanding. Michael,
and we don't have concerns with the Azores Convention, and we don't have. Sorry, I apologise for this, but we're in the midst of. You will hear lots of it today, so let's continue. But obviously, sort of within the Azores Convention and sort of the state aid rules system. So what you're saying is that, as far as public procurement is concerned in Northern Ireland, that isn't an issue.
No, Michael, do you want to come in on that?
No, I mean state aid rules may still be in existence for some of the companies in international trade agreements anyway. I mean GPA would still have sections in relation to state aid. But in relation to the procurement and the protocol, etc., the only thing that we are aware of is that if we are purchasing certain goods, we need to make sure that the technical specification for those goods is in accordance with the EU specification and UK specification as well, so that allows. So,
as for instance, at the moment, we can't go around sort of building buildings with Chinese fasteners because the EU have put a massive penalty on them, which doesn't apply to the rest of the UK.
Yeah.
Okay, that's thanks.
The other, just to finish off on the Procurement Board very, very quickly, the other piece of work was on the major capital projects, which was subject to a Public Accounts Committee. So the Procurement Board set up a subgroup to look at this specifically and to look at to improve visibility, future contract opportunities and the risk allocation, which I've already talked to, that those papers will be coming to the Executive. The other one was about the data that was analysed. So there was a number of projects mentioned in the Northern Ireland Audit Office report, and that led to a suggestion that we should review the procurement structures and processes, and it has been agreed that there's insufficient data to identify the absolute root causes of why those delays took place. So there will be a data exercise to capture exactly where the root causes were, and that exercise is ongoing, and SIB are in the lead in that. And then you will be aware the investment strategy is out for consultation, and part of that is the investment strategy delivery tracking system, which has been updated to include a range of additional data, and that will improve visibility of forthcoming procurement opportunities, which in turn will instill confidence within the sector about the timing and nature of the contracts to be released. So that's what I have on the Procurement Board. Happy to move on to the Procurement Reform Bill unless there's any questions.
Yeah, yes, please. Yep.
Move on.
Yep.
We'll come back.
We'll come back.
Okay. As the committee will be aware from previous updates, CPD officials have been working with the Cabinet Office to develop policy instructions for the new Procurement Reform Bill. There has been some criticism that the current rules and practices for public procurement are bureaucratic, complex and unattractive to companies interested in securing government contracts. Key advantages of the bill are that it will simplify and consolidate the current legislation into a single, uniform regulatory framework. establish a new procurement review unit which focuses on non-compliance within the new regime, overseeing the integrity of public procurement system. And it will also embed greater transparency throughout the procurement process to provide suppliers with more meaningful information in a timely manner. This will entail publishing data at every stage of the procurement process, which is easily accessible for suppliers and members of the public. And you will note from our recent correspondence that the Executive has agreed that provisions will be made for our jurisdiction in the Procurement Reform Bill. And just to sum up, Chair, this is an exciting time for public procurement and a real opportunity to be involved in a programme of reform which can deliver efficiencies both for the public and private sector. And if you're content, I'll pass over to Michael, who will now give you an update on the Common Framework.
Yes, please, Michael.
Thank you, Sharon. The committee will be familiar with the Common Framework. It scrutinised it last year. But just to summarise again, I mean, this is a replacement for previous memorandums, understandings and concordats that each of the administrations has had with the former OGC and now Cabinet Office on how we coordinate public procurement in respect mainly of international trades. Three key objectives for that common framework are to ensure the continuing function of the internal market within the UK, whilst acknowledging that each of the administrations may use public procurement as a tool to further wider policy objectives. We need to, at minimum, ensure we comply with our international trade obligations and ensure that any future trade negotiations or treaties can continue to perform. I mean, it's really a non-legally binding document. It's an agreement where we will come together to discuss policy divergence and make sure that we're not, in each of the administrations, taking any action in public procurement that may actually create inadvertently barriers in that. The framework does have standard mechanisms in it, as the same as in all frameworks, for dispute resolution, escalation of any issues. And we now have an agreed terms of reference for the various groups to meet throughout the year to come together to discuss that. Hopefully that will be kicking off later this year. And at the minute we are at stage 4, and we sent a copy of the framework to the committee back in November, and we are still able to take any comments or views the committee have, and we will present those back to the working group on this.
Okay, thanks very much. I've asked a few questions as I've gone through, and I'll probably come back to one or two just at the end of it. But Malaysia, you're up first.
Okay, Fáilte Rómh, agus Buíochta do Ratchis, thank you for your statement, and you're very welcome here this afternoon too. Just in relation to procurement and that, and we know that it's probably central to all parties' objectives in terms of the social clause and that within contracts. And those that are awarding the contracts, what's in, has anything been specifically provided to them so that they know how to identify best and to evaluate, I would say, the social value?
If I can take that, Chair?
Yep.
The biggest opportunity to identify the best mechanism to both incorporate social value and get the best social outcomes is with pre-market engagement. That's engaging with service providers and also communities and end users. So a big emphasis on the social value policy is that when a need is identified, that the Commissioner or the Department engages with the people most affected and also those that are going to potentially provide those services. And that identifies what can be incorporated, what can be maximised. There is also training. I mentioned that the Strategic Investment Board have been working since the policy was launched in July last year to develop training, and that training has been rolled out. Feedback from members today, from the industry representatives today, were very supportive of the training that has been done, and SIB are maintaining really close links with all sectors and have welcomed any other sectors out there who would tender for government contracts who don't feel that they understand where they can access the training or need other help, just to contact CPD on our website or else contact SIB.
And I'm sure that actually would include the unions and that as well.
Yeah, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is actually a member of the Procurement Board. There's a representative on the Procurement Board. Yeah. So, yeah.
Social value and given the intention of it, that where it would help to support the local economy and local contractors and the likes of it as well too, that if one found that 20% was not working or wasn't achieving the objectives that one hope to achieve. Do you have any sort of flexibility that allows, allows them to raise that from 20%?
It's at 10% at the minute. So
10%.
And it is a minimum. What we are saying, this is a minimum. So there are things that you may need to do in order to secure local supply. You may need to increase that to 20 or 30% before it starts to make a difference. So it is a minimum, and we do stress that. There will be a review of this because the policy intent is to increase it to 20% by June 2023, but that will be subject to review and obviously executive endorsement at that point in time. But every policy note, and this is something that's different because the criticism previously was that there was no evaluation of whether the policy was working or whether it was meeting its policy objectives. So every policy note you will see there's a monitoring arrangement at the back of the policy note, and there will be an annual procurement report published every year to show progress. And if all of the policy notes will obviously allow flexibility, and their minister can agree to opt out. But where that opt-out is activated, that will also become part of that annual report. So there's full transparency. But we believe by recording and getting the data and monitoring the data, it will allow us to evaluate whether the policy is working. It may be that some people say that 20% is maybe too much in some sectors, maybe 10% is adequate, and we'll have to take, obviously, consideration of that as we work our way through.
Thank you. And note too that there's concerns maybe that when it comes to the allocation of contracts that are, let's say, below threshold, that in some way will disadvantage Northern Irish firms for applying for those same contracts in Britain.
No, there should be no. Go ahead.
I'm going to take this way. This is in relation to the advice note that was published by Cabinet Office back last year, where they had actually suggested that in order to pursue social value and other objectives, that because there isn't any legal requirement below threshold, that they were advising that some local authorities may decide to restrict procurement to a county level. We have had various conversations with them in relation to that to try and encourage them that it's not really very good to have that sort of restriction, but the legal advice that they have had on that is that because they're actually restricting it to county level, they're not actually discriminating on a national level, and therefore it's okay to do them. But I can assure you that officials from Scotland, Wales, and ourselves are asking Cabinet Office to review that. Right, the last discussion we've had with them, they're indicating that it hasn't really been used.
It hasn't been used, and the Cabinet Office said that they themselves would keep note of that. That's right. Too, yeah. And have they fed back to date in any respect or given you any sort of update on it?
All they have said is that the data that they have suggesting that it has very rarely been used because there is a recognition, even within England, that some of the local authorities don't want to apply it either because in the interests of SMEs and movement of opportunities, they're not welcome to do it. But it is more where they have identified a specific social value or economic objective. There has to be a real good reason behind doing it.
But it has been used in some cases.
I believe it has been used in a few cases.
All the more reason why it is that we should have that concern, and particularly for the Northern Irish firms, where I'm sure we all know that many of our firms here locally will tender for contracts in that in Britain.
We haven't had any feedback from local companies saying they're being disadvantaged at the minute, but we certainly will keep that under review.
Sure.
Thanks ever so much for your
Very
answers.
welcome.
Thank
Thank
you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Felicia. Jim? Alistair?
Yeah, thank you. What examples would you give us of positive difference being made by the Procurement Board, if any?
I'm happy to take that. I think what we have seen over the last 12 months is a tremendous speed. We have 5 policy notes that have been signed off by the Executive, and given the Executive's workload, I think the priority that the Executive had given public procurement policy has actually surprised us. The common agreement that public procurement policy should be used as an enabler has really surprised us.
But in what way has that manifested itself in practical changes in procurement?
What we have seen is, well, certainly the score and social value will only come into play in June 2022. That's the scoring of social value, but we have a few pilots that are ongoing. And the help of SIB to help those We have one in LPS, which was their revenue and benefits system that incorporated social value, and we're now seeing the benefits coming, that contract's been awarded, that the points for the scoring of social value will help.
Are there any changes to the procurement process that you would point to?
The procurement process is actually going to be enabled by the toolkit, which came to the Procurement Board today. And we are very keen. There's some guidance notes that are currently on our system that are over 10 years, and they're still there. We are very keen to get those down and to have a more commercial focus towards a more less transactional, less process-orientated approach to public procurement. But we're not there, I can say.
Still all pretty aspirational.
I would say there's signs of that practice coming to play. I would probably like it to be progressing a lot faster than it is, and I appreciate your comments.
I raised an issue with you back in the autumn about subcontractors and how main contractors were maybe exploiting subcontractors, using their good name, and then putting pressure on for the subcontractor to reduce their costs once they won the contract, partially relying on the good name of the subcontractor. What practically has been done to address that problem?
After that, and thank you very much for that, that helped put the spotlight on something that was anecdotal, so thank you very much for that. What we did after that was meet the Procurement Board representative who represents small and medium suppliers in the construction industry, and from that we have developed a draft public procurement policy note which hopefully will go to the Procurement Board next month, and it is about the fair treatment of subcontractors. It is about making it more difficult to have that Dutch auction when contracts are awarded, to play one subcontractor after another. I have said openly in the Procurement Board that we will not tolerate unacceptable behaviour or sharp practices towards subcontractors. And that message, we believe, is filtering through, but certainly it will not be until we get that public or the procurement policy note endorsed by the Procurement Board and signed off by the Executive, that will then be mandated.
What sanction will that policy note give you?
What, sorry?
What sanction will that deliver to you?
Well, it means it must be applied, and you can only opt out of it if a minister agrees. What we're also doing again is to monitor the implementation of that. So we will be asking subcontractors to raise these issues, and they will have the authority to do it because but
there's a chill factor in doing that. There's a chill factor in raising it, in that you're dependent, if you're the subcontractor, you're dependent on keeping in with the contractor.
And we do appreciate that, and that's why we have a representative who is happy to take feedback from subcontractors. We will protect the identity. We want people to raise issues. We want to ensure that if we're spending public money, that we have ethical supply chains and ethical practices in those supply chains. The other big part of the procurement reform is the procurement review unit. And what they will do is to take suppliers' feedback on board and fight their case for them. To make sure the poor practices are taken out of the supply chain for government contracts.
Just a quick review then of the protocol issue. So where we are on that is we've been liberated from all the prescriptive list of things which are in the EU procurement directives, save that when we are procuring goods which must be EU compliant, that has to be specified, but we no longer advertise in the official journal of the EU or subject to all their extraneous rules. Is that a fair summary?
If I talk on the rules first of all, because at the minute the public contracts regulations are a copy out of the EC directive that was in place at the time. So in effect the public contracts regulations as they stand are exactly as we were post-Brexit.
We're deliberately to change those.
But that's what the Procurement Reform Bill is tasked to do. It is to lift that prescription and procedural nature of the procurement contracts regulations, which had to be a copy out of the EU directives, and give us much more flexibility and make it more commercially focused and the ability to incorporate social value. So that's
so the Procurement Reform Bill will apply in its entirety to Northern Ireland?
There are parts of the Procurement Reform Bill that we can opt out of because it is more on the policy remit that we want to allow the Executive to retain control over. So, Michael, do you want to take up the SMEs?
Yeah, I think just to say that a big part of the reform bill is exactly what you've said, which is to streamline the complex processes that are demanded. I think we're sitting with about 7 procedures that can be followed. We don't use an awful lot of them in Northern Ireland, but we want to streamline that back to very simple processes that small businesses understand. And in the interest of trying to speed up procurement and give easy access to businesses, we want to have a standard set of processes across the administrations that we party to the bill, if you like. Where we will probably not be party to the bill is that previously, even under the European procurement law, Cabinet Office had legislated for some wider policy issues that came out of a Lord Young reform back in 2012, which was to help SMEs, such as mandating the advertising of contracts over £10,000, no use of pre-qualification questionnaires below threshold and other matters, prompt payment by departments. Now, when we looked at that in 2015, we opted out at that point because we already had policies set by the Procurement Board, which were probably a little bit in advance at that time of what those proposals were to do. So we would be recommending that we continue on that path to give the executive the right to set its own policy direction on those matters, because it's not required by international trade agreements. But for the large part, the new reform bill will address simpler procurement processes, procedures, timescales. You had mentioned the use of most advantageous tender. It'll move away from most economically advantageous tender. Even dropping that word economic gives us much more scope to consider wider issues across government, rather than the current rules only allowed to be considered at a department level. So we will be in the procurement reform bill for all that, but we would recommend that we retain the right to set our own policy direction where it's not required by international trade agreements.
The bill allows that?
The bill will allow that.
So will there be a legislative consent motion? Or?
There will be a need for a legislative consent motion later in the year when the clauses are actually drafted.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Gemma?
Thank you, and thank you both for coming in. I just have one question, and it probably seems a bit obvious, but can you clarify CPD's role in procurement? Do you manage and deliver procurement, or is this more of just an advisory role?
I'll answer that if you don't mind, Gemma. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you what CPD does, because there is a lot of confusion out there about what we actually do. So CPD, and we've actually grown recently, we have taken on responsibility for Properties Division since the 1st of November. We also look after Property Management Division, which has been with CPD for quite a number of years. But in terms of the procurement element of CPD, we have 3 operational scopes, which are Health Projects, Construction Division and Supplies and Service Division, and then we have our Policy Division. Part of the policy is also the Gateway Review process. So what the Policy Division is there to do is to support the Procurement Board in its policy implementation. So they provide the Secretariat to the Procurement Board. They help the subgroups meet and do the co-design between construction firms and procurement staff. We also are instrumental probably in the heads of procurement group, bringing all the centres of procurement expertise together. At one point, the CPD's role was much stronger when the Procurement Board was with PermSecs, because there was generally that they were expecting the expertise to come from CPD, so all the guidance notes were really been driven from CPD and signed off by the PermSecs. But with the change of the Procurement Board, that has really changed the influence or control of procurement policy or guidance from CPD more to the Procurement Board, because it's generally co-design and it is agreed by the Procurement Board and then signed off by the Executive. Does that help, Gemma?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. That's me.
Yeah. Matthew?
Thank you, Chair. I can sense the immense disappointment in the room today that the protocol isn't getting in the way of any of your work. So very sorry for those in the committee who are very eager for that to be a problem. But just going back to some of the issues around Brexit, actually, we talked about the issue of what the Construction Employers Federation asked for in terms of the Cabinet Office note. Now, the reason the Cabinet Office are able to issue that note, or the reason theoretically that below threshold procurement might offer that flexibility for a local authority, for a Derby Council or Liverpool Council or whatever to do a below threshold procurement within a county. The reason for that is that EU procurement rules no longer apply. And the Construction Employers Federation had said to us that they have been concerned that Northern Ireland bidders might be disadvantaged. So at the minute, the situation is that the situation still pertains. You had conversations with the Cabinet Office, but they haven't offered any legislative intervention or clarity that that won't happen. Okay. And so that's not covered by the protocol, but it's a consequence of Brexit in terms of procurement that Northern Ireland. But so that's one thing in terms of suppliers obviously here in a relatively small market, and so they'll bid into the much bigger English market. Unfortunately, Brexit's sort of removing a protection for them, it would seem. In relation to this, to the Republic, because obviously contractors here are also, but are they protected? Would they have the same protections as other bidders from in the Republic, or is there any loss of protection there in terms of their ability to bid for contracts?
Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, I think this year, even EU procurement law only applies above threshold.
Yes, yeah.
Where we were previously is the principles of the EU treaty, the function of the treaty provided below threshold, which required us to, maintain principles of non-discrimination, fair treatment, and transparency. However, the main rights of remedy to any supplier lies above threshold, which is there in the international legislation. That is still protected as a member of GPA. We still have the right above threshold. The question has always been what happens below threshold, and there isn't any legislative right of redress for a supplier there. But
that came from the below threshold protection came from the EU membership
treaty.
Yeah. So we don't have that now in relation to England in a sense, or the South of Ireland, or GB, or the South of Ireland, theoretically.
No, theoretically, no.
Okay.
But we don't have any evidence that anybody has been unfairly treated in any way.
That's fair enough, and obviously you would. But I think it's just worth putting on the record, and I'm not doing this to be political, but given we've had a lot of conversations about, I'm not asking you to confirm this, your officials, and you've given really thorough and helpful evidence today, but just the protocol does not interact with procurement law. You've confirmed that. Northern Ireland suppliers are at a potential disadvantage against people bidding in both GB, particularly England, and the Republic of Ireland, because of the removal of the protections of EU membership and procurement law. So I just wanted to put that on the record and make sure it's absolutely crystal clear. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Pat?
Well, I think Matthew stole the thunder again. But I suppose maybe in simple terms, thanks very much for your evidence. But I was just saying on that procurement, Northern Ireland, you've already said it to the Chair as well, and on the policy, there's no change. It doesn't affect Northern Ireland at all. If we adopt this policy, we're in a position that there is no change, and that would follow on that change would not be at odds with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I suppose in layman terms, those bidding for contracts from the north are able to move in and bid within the south or anywhere else within the United Kingdom. Is that? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, in today's modern age, public procurement is really done through electronic means, and I've never heard of anybody restricting access to a tender opportunity from anybody from any country, and they would still be entitled to bid for it. I suppose the question is whether or not, because there isn't any legal requirement through an international trade agreement that somebody rejects a tender from a supplier from another country. But I would believe that's highly unlikely to happen because, obviously there's reciprocal consequences of that where, we do the same thing and then all of a sudden trade stops. So there isn't any evidence of that. I think the question earlier was, is there a legal right to redress below threshold? And there isn't anything set out in international trade agreements that requires a right of access to the courts, for example, from a supplier from another country.
And as I read it, Sharon had said just earlier, Chair, that the Procurement Board, there's a meeting today of them, the 2nd, and that policy If it looks like it will be adopted, will be led at the executive.
So there's two policies that were approved today
Okay.
at the Procurement Board. One is on the procurement pipeline, which is collecting the data and updating that's a requirement for departments to make sure that people have visibility of the infrastructure investment. And the second policy is about the standard form of contract for construction, NEC4, which includes the apportion of risk, the appropriate apportion of risk between contractor and contracting authority.
And as you started off, you said that this is an exciting time for procurement, and this is what flows from all of this. It opens up that market and the chances for those that are bidding for that, and makes the competition much more fair, and we protect that public purse. And you're fairly confident that all of them are doing that.
Yeah, that's the reform bill that will come in, that we're working with Cabinet Office in, and hopefully will start to come through in terms of the clauses. At the minute we've just got the policy instructions agreed. We're now looking at the clauses, and when they come through, that's when we'll come with the legislative consent motion.
Good. Thanks, Chair.
Come back. Keith?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thanks, Chair Michael. I have a couple of questions. First one's on the procurement advice note that was issued back in August, the PAN 0121 regarding construction material price increase. When did that come into effect? And are you seeing any evidence of, at what point, if a project was costed, does that kick in on the cost? So if you give a wee bit of information on that to start with, please.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah, the advice note that was published in August set out a number of measures because procurement would be at various stages. We would have existing contracts which hadn't got to the construction phase. We would have contracts midstream. So what the advice note set out was a range of measures that could be taken within contracts. Obviously, if a contract has been agreed, any additional cost or rising costs must be managed within the terms of that contract. So we had advised the departments that there may be measures they could take to try to work with the industry to lessen the impact of those costs in some ways. But that would be a commercial decision for that department to make and to review its own contracts to see what it could do. The second measure within the advice note was that for contracts from after we published it, we had strongly recommended that departments include an inflationary allowance clause, which is called X1. And one of the advice notes that Sharon has just outlined today going forward is the standard form of NEC4 contract, which actually, when the executive hopefully approve, it will mandate the inclusion of X1 in all construction contracts going forward. What X1 allows for is to establish a base date at which the bidder constructed his cost, if you like, to put the tender offer in, which was accepted, as a base date for an inflationary factor. And as time moves on, it allows for the department or contracting authority to make a slight adjustment if costs have gone up unreasonably in the market, and to work with them.
Can we do that retrospectively? Because obviously a lot of costs have already happened.
Yeah, you can't, which is why the advice note said that for existing contracts that without that inflationary clause, we would recommend that departments do consider sitting down with suppliers on an open book basis and trying to work out how much the cost had shifted. It's probably reasonable to assume that the supplier would have anticipated 5-10% shift in margins, because markets move continually all the time. So what we had said is where it has gone up, say 35-40% for steel, that's unreasonable for a supplier to absorb that, and we would encourage departments to try to work that through, but it has to be done within budgets, and it is a commercial decision for each contracting authority because they must do it within the terms of the contract.
Thanks for that, Michael. Do you know, is there any departments using that clause X1?
Yeah, as far as I know, certainly in CPD, most of CPD's contracts have had that in for quite a number of years. And I think the issue over the last number of years is it's obviously a matter of choice. A number of contracting authorities like to have the idea of a fixed price contract for budgetary purposes because they don't have to anticipate additional money. Other departments, I think particularly in the likes of roads, they use a sector type scheme which sort of works off a base rate for the cost of raw materials. Some contracts do have a pricing mechanism within them, throwing out, if you're going to buy something like electrical cable, it's very highly dictated upon the price of copper, so it works off a markup from the exchange rate of copper on the London Stock Exchange, etc. So it's a matter of choice that departments take up to now as to whether they include it for inflation or not. There are other mechanisms within NEC3 which you can go on a cost plus or an open book basis. The opportunities there, but
many contracts on cost plus?
I wouldn't actually have that data off the top of my mind because it is a matter of choice, but it is an option within NEC.
Okay, and one final question, Chair. Just a general point, Michael or Sharon, regarding construction division cost. Say you're building a hospital, school, whatever. How much is weighted on the actual cost of the bidder? So, for example, if two bidders is cost, budgeting for a project, and one's out 1%, 2%, 3% cheaper than the other one, what way does that work in comparison to all the other boxes in simple terms they have to tick? So, at what point will they never have a fit to catch up? And at what point is cost more important than other things? And obviously it is public money, I appreciate that. So you know where I'm coming from. So if the percentages, if they're that far apart, will the lower bidder ever get the tender? Or sorry, higher bidder, should I say? Higher bidder.
I guess it really depends on the design of the tender process. There's obviously going to be an element of quality in there. There are various ways of doing that. Some jobs, as I understand it, depending on how far they are down the design route, may actually have a design which has been costed, and bidders will be asked to come in within a certain tolerance of that cost. There are other contracts that will go out from different authorities that will require the contractor to bid on quality and price, and they will balance quality and price. But I think the answer is there isn't really any defined way of doing it. It's a matter of commercial choice from the contracting authority of how they approach the market and how they want to ensure quality and ensure reasonable costs. Obviously, there's a tendency maybe if you drive lowest cost that companies will continually undercut to try and win the business. And I think you need to be very careful in the current economic climate with what's going on, is that companies are pretty let's say focused on public sector work as there's drying up in the private sector, and we need to guard against that. But it is a commercial decision of the various contracting authorities when they go to market.
But does the lower bidder always get the project?
You would have to analyse the data to identify that, but I would suggest that that's probably not always the case, no.
Okay, thanks Michael, thanks Sharon, thanks Chair.
Okay. Just a couple of ones before we let you go. The procurement reform bill, in the procurement review unit, sort of how we're doing that, but also the changes to related court processes and the capping of damages, etc. Because one of the concerns we've obviously had is the whole sort of legal process. The first thing that seems to happen in Northern Ireland when you offer a contract is the next thing is somebody takes a JR on it.
Do you want the capping of costs was considered, but I believe at the minute that it's not really feasible any longer because the realisation of trying to cap the cost of £250,000. There could be contracts out there that are worth hundreds of millions. Maybe not in our market, but certainly in England, some of the contracts are quite huge. So that isn't proceeding. What we are still working on is a much faster process of trying to resolve disputes. And at the minute, we are targeting 28 days for an actual challenge to a decision by the court. We want to maintain the right of somebody to challenge us and challenge those decisions, but what we're trying to do is speed up. One of the difficulties I think we will encounter is that we will be with England and Wales in this bill. England and Wales have the same court system, ours is slightly different. And if I'm right, that they have a special court for this. It's Construction and Technology Court. We don't have the same locally, so we're going to try and engage with DOJ to see can we come up with some mechanism within our court structure to facilitate the measures that will be brought forward in the bill. It's very, very much a focus of the team that's designing the bill to speed up legal challenges and try to prevent them in procurement.
Okay, thanks. The other question is, look, we know, we hear in this committee time and time again the fact that we haven't managed to spend the capital money time and again. If anybody was outside at the moment who was listening into our briefing about Procurement Board, the first thing they would have really wanted to hear about what we were doing about improving procurement in Northern Ireland and being able to do that. Now, we have heard quite a lot about process, and I know from your mission statement to ensure procurement improves in relation for the lives of the Northern Ireland citizen, with the executive's environmental, social and economic priorities and all that sort of thing. But actually what we need to do is fundamentally improve our procurement of government contracts to actually deliver. So having heard that, heard what all the evidence we've heard today, and also we've seen that we still can't spend the capital money we've got and we're giving it back, and we can't spend the financial transactions capital. We seem to be spending most of our time doing some jiggery-pokery in the fact that we sort of repay the money that we have to do that as well. Look, somebody who was sitting outside this who wanted to listen in about procurement, we haven't heard one single thing about procurement during this session. What we have heard about is about process. What are we doing to improve procurement of things in Northern Ireland so we actually deliver? Because we're not getting that. And we know we're not getting that because we're not spending the money we're supposed to be spending on capital. We can't even do that.
Big intake of breath. We're up for the change. I think we all recognise that things are like the major capital projects. The PAC report was very clear that there are things that are not happening quickly enough. There are delays. And whether it's process or whether it's structures, we have to improve. And our biggest way to do this is to take the lessons that have been learned by Cabinet Office and their sourcing and their construction playbook and adopt those here. We are very process orientated, and part of that comes from history, because when you have a very litigious supply base, when you have that litigation, you will concentrate on your process, because that is where the courts will go to. What process did you follow? Did you do what you say you did? So there is generally then a spotlight and an emphasis and a resource put on the process rather than the outcomes. I can say that we have, even reserving contracts, we're very, this is what we have to do. It's, for social enterprises, for community services. The 2 reserve contracts that we tried to do, both we got legal challenges on. Now, other procurement organisations may have said, that's just too difficult, let's not do that again. We're going to continuously do that, because without changing the culture and the perception and the behaviours of people across the system, whether it's procurement people, whether it's departments or whether it's suppliers, we will not change the culture unless we change how we do things. So the toolkits for us are our biggest emphasis, and we will face resistance. We can see some of that. We just have to continue on the battle. This will not change overnight, but we will continue to buy things for generations. We just need to change how we do things in order to deliver things quicker, smarter. Digitalisation, technology, the net zero, all of those initiatives will help us drive improvements in public procurement.
And thanks very much indeed for your evidence session and the rest of it. I think one of the things we as or the committee that comes after us, because obviously with the Finance Minister, and I presume the Finance Minister will continue to be the senior responsible officer, I imagine will be the the terminology for procurement. Sooner or later, somebody's going to has to ask the question, why can't we do procurement? Because we're not doing it well now. Actually, we're doing it badly. So we've got to be able to answer that question about what is the Procurement Board about improving procurement to actually deliver not only value for money, but actually public services and public goods that actually deliver. Can I just come in on that last point? Because I think we are doing procurement well in some instances. I think to criticise ourselves, we're not good enough at telling you the good news stories. You hear public procurement, you think of the last disaster that you heard of. So part of that procurement annual report will also be telling you how well we've done some things, because there's a lot of procurement staff out there who I represent, and I will say they're working very hard and doing their very best. We just need to be more visible about that. There's some absolutely fabulous case studies about social value, but we're not telling anybody about them, and that's our fault, and we need to do that more. Could you actually write to the committee and give us a couple of case examples of, I don't want to see where it's gone badly. We've got the PAC and everybody else that tells it about reams the stuff that's gone badly. Tell us about what has gone well, what has demonstrated, from start to finish of the procurement process where we have actually delivered value for money, delivered the right goods, right services at the right time, with the right people in the right place. And we'd be delighted to see that, because we would be the first people to sing the praises of the procurement system. But unfortunately, the evidence we have in front of us isn't there. But we'd be delighted if you write to the committee about that.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, team. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
You're staying?
You staying?
With us, yeah.
Yeah.
The next one.
Oh, Michael, you're staying with us, are you? So what do you know about architects then?
They're expensive.
Okay, team, just before I finish off that last piece, I've invited the team to write to us with sort of their examples of what's done well, so that would be useful for the committee to know that. Do we have any final views on public procurement common framework? And are we content with it? And we know the Minister is about to sign it. Do we know when the Minister is signing it off anyhow?
We received a letter, I think, yesterday or Monday from TEO, so I think there's been an agreement, if I'm reading it correctly, that ministers can now sign off rather than go back to JMC, because JMC, I understand, has been replaced by INC. So I think we're just waiting for any views the committee may have. We were slightly ahead of things there. The Cabinet Office publication for their scrutiny committee in Parliament got blocked somewhere, I think, over the last couple of months. They've literally just published theirs on Monday.
Okay.
So it's exactly the same framework. It just gets stuck in the machinery somewhere.
Okay.
So there's no big rush on it.
Okay. Oh, two Michaels. Oh, that's confusing the situation now. Okay. Okay, team. Next item on the agenda, LCM Architects Act 1997. The committee will now receive an oral briefing from the Department of Finance on the legislative consent motion for the Building Safety Bill, which will make changes to the Architects Act 1997. And we've got the two Michaels, Michael Watson and Michael McLaurin, and the following papers relating to the agenda items: Clerk's briefing paper at 109, related correspondence from the Minister at page 111, and at page 49 of tabled items. Just for the first, one of the most not surprising thing, but so when we've been in this committee, the number of times we have had to deal with issues with building regulations and the rest of it is, I must admit, it's been quite sobering for me, particularly when we were dealing with the thing with Grenfell and a lot of those issues, and to realise the scope of where the department lies, and to realise the sort of the significance of some of the issues that we're dealing with as well. And I think for somebody who thought most of this committee was going to be about finance and budgeting, to discover these issues, I think has been something that's been quite important. And again, it's something I know when I know I can speak for the rest of the members of the committee on this one. It's something we've all taken a very close interest in because of the importance of what we're trying to do as well. But over to you. So tell us about the Architects Act then.
Thank you, Chair. As you said, this is outworkings of the Grenfell tragedy in 2017. As part of that response, the government in England brought forward a building safety programme of outworkings. Was a bill. That bill has various strands within it which relate to changes to building regulations, changes to construction products regulations, and other strands to try and strengthen up the oversight of the regulation of the construction industry and to improve building and fire safety. One of the measures that is within that bill is changes to the Architects Act 1997, which sets up the Architects Registration Board, which controls the registration and the competence of architects. Now that actually operates across the UK. Scotland, Wales and ourselves, they go through REBA, and RSUA is our local body, but it goes through REBA. So basically...
is RSUA linked directly to that? And it has Memorandum of Understanding and all the sort of professional bodies sort of piece of that as well. Okay. Yeah.
And the same for Scotland and Wales. I mean, the measures in the bill being brought forward in respect of architects is really just to strengthen the Architects Registration Board's oversight of training and assessment of competence and the registration of architects, and more powers to bar architects if they don't come up to that competence standard. There are some small clauses in there in relation to the charges that the ARB register to allow that service to happen, because they will have to increase the costs in some way to allow for that facilitation. And more recently, in the last week, I think with a further debate in the Lords, there was an agreement to add another further amendment to allow for an appeal process, which makes perfect sense that if someone has been debarred, they have the right to appeal, or if their registration has been withheld because they haven't done training and development, other competence standards, they have 40 days to which to appeal on that. The difficulty we have locally is you'll probably I've come to know over the last year is that some of the measures in this building safety bill, there isn't any department locally with policy responsibility.
Yeah.
And the working of the cross-departmental group, we had agreed to at least bring forward the LCM, to try and help.
So just to get this right, because I remember we were briefed, I think it was by the head of the Northern Ireland, or who was then the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, who wasn't a civil servant, if you know what I mean, when she was there. But it was then taken as building regulations was going to be a subset of that sat off from the executive to be that, and then they decided that wasn't going to deal with building regulations. Building regulations reform will come back to the Department of Finance. So does it all lie with us now, or how?
I'll try to explain from my knowledge of it. Within this building safety bill, there are 5 parts. One's an introduction. The second part relates to changes that England is making to its building regulations to bring in a new building safety regulator rule and other measures in relation to the voice of residents in buildings where previously they believed that they were raising safety concerns, but nobody there to listen to them, nobody was doing anything about it. Those are all devolved matters. So we need to address those ourselves in some way, whether we do it through the building regulations or whether we do it through some other way.
The Department of Finance has ownership of that now. Of
building regulations.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, as I understand, but that you need to make a decision whether that is the mechanism with which you want to make those changes. You could be doing it a different way, and I am not up to speed on the decision on that. I understand that the department is putting together an expert panel. Because in conversations with Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, I think as they're called today, over the last year, we have to accept that Northern Ireland is very small in relation to this, and we don't have the same extent of high-rise buildings. And do we really need this a big building safety regulator rule? We do need to implement those measures somehow, and in some of the discussions that's gone on, the local building control authority have suggested that they could carry out part of that function. But what we now need to agree is what is the best way to have that set up so that we do avail from all these new enhanced measures of building safety, but without going over the top and setting a regime that's not absolutely necessary. That's where we are. But there are other parts of this bill, such as the New Homes Ombudsman, which is actually a matter that's sort of not arguably it's new, so it's not reserved or accepted. I think Department for Economy is working with Department for Communities across the water to bring that forward to make sure that citizens here in new homes have the same opportunity. There are the changes to the Architects Act and the Construction Products Regulations, which was actually formerly EU directive, EU regulation that did not require implementation in domestic law. But as a result of Brexit, that regulation has now been brought in to UK law, but it is still a reserved matter. And the issue in there is when a defective product becomes known or whether there's an alert, who would the construction product regulator in England inform in Northern Ireland? You need to be careful of this product. So that's, and some of this is new because some of our departments have never had policy responsibility or private sector housing and all these sorts of things, and we're finding our way through it. But in relation to the architects, it's those 3 clauses that we have been asked for a legislative consent motion on. Initially, the Minister responsible and Minister for Housing Communities, local as it was then, had actually informed us last year that they didn't believe a legislative consent motion was necessary because it was not a reserved or accepted matter. In December, that legal opinion changed, and they're now asking us for the legislative consent motion.
Right.
And unfortunately, they're asking for it at quite
like now.
pace.
Yeah. Wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't. Jim?
Yeah, if there was a regulatory authority, who would fund that?
That's a good question. There is some movements in England to raise certain levies against developer taxes and other measures that they are being considered to try and raise that additional money, not only for the regulator but for the repairs, as you'll be aware now, of the cladding in the buildings and so forth. But I'm not over the detail of that.
So it wouldn't be profession funded?
Well, it is going to be a government function, so it will have to be whether you raise the revenue in some other way, or whether it's directly funded. And at the minute, this is really an extension of the, I think the issue that they had there is that, you have building control going out and approving that something's been built and stuff, but this regulator rule was to go further into behaviours within the construction industry, not just look at the building, but how the various disciplines within industry, contractor, designer, were interacting. There were some accusations that, designers have designed something, but what the contractor built is not what was designed. And it's more the regulation of that to try and tighten up behaviours within the construction industry.
And the scope of any regulation, it would obviously extend to architects, but would it extend to those who call themselves architectural technicians?
It's a good question. Architectural technicians would not be members of REBA.
Yeah, that's correct.
Or the architectural assistants would not be members of REBA. This is really to control architects and those that are actually through REBA.
It's not the bigger stuff. But
yeah.
We as MLAs probably meet complaints from time from constituents who feel that they haven't been well served by the person they call their architect, but he or she turns out to be an architectural technician.
Yeah, and that's it's a longer sort of debate. We've had this argument raised with CPD over the years as well, as when we go to procure design teams, why do we always specify an architect when in fact an architectural technician, when it's more sort of just structural, is probably quite qualified to do that, but it's where you're into the aesthetic design and the more sort of architectural type features, you really need an architect. But that's a matter of understanding before you engage somebody what they are qualified to do.
Okay. Just a question. If we decide not to do the LCM, not that I'm saying we're proposing to do that, what are the consequences for Northern Ireland firms? To take it that's it, they can't do...
It's a good question. None, because all our architects locally will be REBA approved and ARB anyway. Yeah. So, and they will, I would imagine they'll move the bill forward anyway because it will affect the other devolved administrations. So I think this may be where there was confusion about whether a legislative consent motion was required or not.
Sorry, Keith? Keith?
It's not you. Can you put Keith into the spotlight? There we go.
Go ahead, Keith.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. My question's relating to the ARB, or the Architect Registration Board. And one of the documents I'm reading here, it says to monitor competence of architects. What do they currently do to monitor that?
Do you want to take it on, Michael?
Yeah.
Michael's an architect, so he may be able to.
Yeah. Might be competent to answer.
The title of architect is a legally protected title in the UK. So to practice as an architect in the UK, you must be registered with the Architects Registration Board. The Architects Registration Board has a code of professional conduct which requires registered architects to undertake a certain amount of CPD, that's continual professional development, within their area of expertise, so to develop knowledge and skills within the area in which they work. That is an annual requirement, and it's taken on a professional approach basis that you will honour that. It's not currently explored or investigated unless you were reported for a disciplinary procedure. So it's up to architects to maintain their own records of CPD. Now, the other body that exists in the UK is the Architects Professional Membership Body, which is the Royal Institution of British Architects. And they have a requirement for their members to undertake 35 hours of CPD every year and to record that on an online system. And that is checked on an annual basis. That's part of your renewal of your fee, that you have your CPD in order and in place. So I think the outcome of the Grenfell inquiry has sort of shown that the ARB's approach to checking of competency maybe isn't as strong as it needs to be, and that's why this proposal has been brought forward.
Okay. Will it be obviously be mandatory, won't it?
It will be mandated, yes.
Back to Keith. Sorry, Keith.
So see, whenever those checks, Michael, are carried out on an architect, we'll call them checks or audits. Does that involve going to site? Does that involve previous work, current work, or what does that involve? Or is it just that you're effectively doing some more training?
No, This is about training outside of your work hours, or it could be within your work hours. This is about continuing your knowledge and understanding of the world in which you work, to improve, always continual improvement. So you'll be required to maintain a record of how much time you've spent on attending particular seminars on particular subjects. And if you look at the RIBA model, for instance, they have that requirement for 35 hours, of which 20 are mandatory in 10 core subjects. So that's broken down into sustainability, legal and professional, design, technical, construction, and so on. So you're always trying to continue to improve your knowledge in those areas. I would imagine that when the detail is finalised with ARB, it will follow something similar.
That assumes that the knowledge you gain or learn or develop is put into practice.
Yes, it does.
So it's not really, how will this prevent an architect making a mistake to prevent another Greenville?
I think where this has come from is that the architects involved with the Grenfell inquiry openly admitted to having a lack of knowledge in the area of a lack of knowledge or expertise in the area in which they were working. And if you read the testimonies, it's quite damning, actually. But it's not clear whether they've undertaken continual professional development or not, and I'm not around the detail on that. But that's where the proposals from Dame Judith Hackett have come from. It's that understanding that there were individuals there that weren't up to speed with their own profession, and then looking at how the profession monitors that, and then looking at how that can be strengthened.
I think the easiest way to explain it is that an architect can still make a mistake, but at least they will have undertaken the training and had the competence to do the job properly. It'll never prevent making a mistake, but it's likely to decrease the likelihood of that.
With respect to Grenfell, the architects involved there had no prior experience of working on high-rise residential buildings of that height, and weren't aware that there were particular technical requirements for the cladding with respect to fire safety on buildings of that height, and so we're working blind, and that came out at the inquiry. So it's to try, if you strengthen competency and test competency on an annual basis, it should improve things, but it won't stop everything.
How are you testing it, Michael, on an annual basis? How are they going to test competency?
If you attend a particular seminar on a particular subject, it will have to be authorised or certified as being an accredited seminar. That's how the RIBA does it at the moment. So you will invariably get companies that are trying to sell their wares, but they structure their seminar around the safety elements of their wares or the sustainability aspects of their products or whatever. They have to take those products and their scheme to the RIBA for authorisation or accreditation in terms of being an approved seminar. And that's how the structured process to CPD is managed within the RIBA. The detail around how the ARB are going to do it is still to be ironed out, but I would imagine it will be something similar.
Is there going to be a set of, and I remember I've read quite a lot on sort of the Grenfell inquiry, but one of the things about the architect says, well, they were being used in areas where they're not SWEP for.
Yep.
And this whole SWEP process, is the proposal of this is that you'll be SWEP for working on high-rise buildings or SWEPed on whatever happens to be our particular sectors? Because one of the concerns I think has been raised is said, oh, I've done CPD, but I did CPD on HR and on COSH and about 3 or 4 other things. I didn't actually do any CPD on the latest developments in structural engineering or something like that. But I've done my CPD. How do you get to the point where you make sure that the CPD is relevant? How's that being addressed?
I think that's down to the competence. You have to be assessed to be competent to undertake certain works. the CPD is there to help you to make sure your training is developed, so that will be addressed through the competence. I think where the clauses are setting out the powers for the ARB, there will be more detailed procedures behind that, which we don't have at the minute, and I'm sure they're being developed. But this is really to set the powers in place for the Architects Registration to have better oversight and more awareness, and require that level of competence to be registered.
Okay.
Chair, before you move on that, could I ask one question?
Yeah, just one.
Just from your own experience, Michael, of CPD, does it amount to anything more than getting whatever the specified number of points is, 12 or whatever, which you get by attending talks or lectures for the purpose of getting the tick that you've been there? Does it really amount to anything more than that?
There is a fair charge in that, but some of the seminars may have a test at the end of it. So whether you've been listening or whether you just attended for the sandwiches is another question. But invariably, you choose the subjects in which you're working that suit your workload that's coming ahead, so that you're fully up to speed on whatever the latest is for that area. So, for instance, on Grenfell, would you be attending a seminar on cladding? Would you be attending a seminar on insulation and the fire properties of that insulation, fire breaks behind the cladding, high-rise buildings, all those sorts of things? If you were going to work on a project like that and knew it was coming within your workload in the next 12 months, you would try and set up, taking a professional approach about it, you would try and set yourself up to attend seminars that would inform you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Okay.
Chair.
Matthew?
Thank you. I just had a couple of questions re the Act, and then also the broader questions covered by the here in Northern Ireland. Is there a particular sense? So obviously this is kind of coming out of Grenfell, and you described, Michael, the fairly shocking kind of issues around lack of expertise, basically, from architects in relation to that. Is there a particular sense that those are issues which are, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but are there concerns about that being a particular problem here too? Or is it just that this is sensible? It's sensible to cover the whole UK.
In developing the proposals for the changes to the Architects Act, the ELUHC consulted with the Royal Society of Ulster Architects here, and their response was by and large welcoming of any proposals to improve public safety and fire safety, but they did make a note to say that they didn't believe that it would overly increase competency here, because they felt competency was already quite high. So,
okay, that's good, I suppose. So I have another question which is related to Grenfell, and I think it's a question for CPD, but it would just be helpful to get your view, and I don't know whether the department's given any thought to it. There's been a lot of commentary about Kingspan and its relationship with Ulster Rugby, and whether that's an appropriate relationship to continue. I'm not necessarily making a comment on that, but does CPD have any view? Has it given any instruction in relation to Kingspan and dealing with Kingspan?
It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, Kingspan inevitably will have provided some product in the supply chain at some point, but CPD would be so far removed, from that. We would have awarded a contract to a major contractor who may have designed something, who may have finished up using a Kingspan type product, but it's going to be very, very far down the supply chain for us to really get it, and we wouldn't really have a view on whether that product should be used or not. I mean, it's obviously, there's a lot of process behind that about testing it. Is it the right thing? Is there alternatives? But it'd be very far down the supply chain for us.
I suppose if there was a department to have a view, it would probably be yours, and I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying, given you're responsible for buildings regulation, it would be it's still. I'm genuinely not suggesting you should have come here today with a view on that company in particular. Okay, that's helpful. One final question is actually slightly tangential to specific issues in the Architects Act, and that is about a subject I hate to have to bring up all the time, but we were talking about before, Brexit and mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which is does touch a bit on architects' work. Is that
that's being addressed as well by Department of Levelling Up and Communities as well. It's not part of this bill, but it is. Yeah. It's been looked at, and they are trying to recognise that there needs to be equivalency to the qualifications to be able to allow the services to continue.
And is that something that are you aware of? For example, I mean, I presume it shouldn't be an issue in doing for Northern Irish architects working in projects in England, but has there been any, I mean, there might not have been, but has there been any examples yet of that proving a barrier to, for example, taking on a project in the south or anything like that? No. I presume they can be, okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, just before you go, in the previous evidence session we were talking about risk, and one of the things about sort of procurement reform was about where the level of risk was going to be and the appetite from risk when you're looking at sort of contracts and procurement.
Sure.
One of the things that must be about risk is you need to make sure that you have the appropriately swept people to be able to both assess the risk on one side of it, which we have in you, Michael, because you're a qualified architect and got all the bits and pieces. Yeah. But again, if we're saying that risk has to be held lower in your previous evidence session, obviously by the sort of the department or whoever was the person who was pushing for the original procurement piece, how do you make sure that the people that you're dealing with, like for instance the architects, are actually the appropriate people? You might have a fully qualified architect, but do you know that they're qualified on the particular thing that you want to be able to do and develop? How do you have that degree of intelligence? I hate using sort of declaration of interest here. I used to work for the Ministry of Defence, and they were awful at procurement and still are. But one of the things they came up with is the whole idea of the intelligent customer. And there was a process where you had to be suitably trained to actually understand what the issues were. And during your previous, and there was something that was bugging me during the previous evidence session, I never heard that sort of language being used. So how do we make sure that happens?
Okay.
Apart from giving it all to Michael, who's going to carry the entire list.
We'll get Michael to do it all. The procurement process allows contract authorities to assess the professional qualifications of anybody that's coming forward to do the work, either at contractor level or individual level. I think where that intelligent client bit come in is that what MOD was suggesting is that we need to know who we want to do the job. And I think that's where CPD plays a major part with departments, because we have that technical expertise in helping somebody to understand that you do need an architect, you need a civil engineer, a quantity surveyor. And actually we would carry out a check in the procurement process to make sure that anybody we're going to award the contract to had that ability to do that. The issue that we were talking about earlier in relation to the NEC contract is not really in relation to that. It's about the transfer of liability between contractor and government. Sometimes we have a tendency maybe to transfer entire liability for something out to a contractor. The contractor has to go and buy insurance. They would actually have to risk price the contract. They'd have to build a huge amount of contingency in it in case something did go wrong. The issue of value for money in that situation is that where that issue doesn't arise, the contractor is not going to give us the money back. So it's clean profit. And what we're trying to do with the NEC 4 is to try and make sure we get to a consistent position of how much risk should be given to the contractor to ensure, and how much risk we can absorb locally. The other risk that you're referring to is just making sure that the person you're awarding the contract to is suitably qualified, and that is addressed in the procurement process, at the ISA process.
Yeah, because obviously one of the things we're getting in the media right now is obviously with the PPE. Yeah. We needed PPE in a hurry. We procured huge chunks of PPE. Large chunks of it, close on £1 billion, and if you understand the media, weren't actually fit for purpose. Yeah. So I know it's just a question on that. Look, team, I know it went on slightly longer than we expected, but thank you very much indeed for your evidence and the rest of it. Okay, thank you, both of you. Okay, team, have we any other further actions we wish to take forward? No. Thank you.
The committee then consent to wait for an answer from the Ross side of Ulster Architects, and just see what they say on this, because I think the committee will be asked to make up its mind about this LCM shortly.
I think we should get something back from the Ross side of Ulster Architects. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, thank you.
Just a query. Does an architect do 7 years at university? Is that correct?
I don't know if it's 7 years anymore, but...
No?
I don't think you do 7 years at anything. Even a doctor only does about 5
years. I think an architect's still 7 years.
I think they'd have a couple of years.
I don't know. That's me leaving school at 15. I'm only checking that.
They do a couple of years out, not all study.
Okay, team, the next thing we're dealing with is is fire safety building regulations. The committee will now receive an oral briefing from the Department of Finance officials on a proposed statute rule on the Building Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2022. On Starleaf, hopefully. We've got Billy and Damien. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we have. Apologies, we're running a bit late. We've had a few IT issues today, and if you hear the division bell ringing as we progress our way through, we're in the midst of legislating for the climate change bill between now and a lot later. Team, Clerk's briefing paper is at page 117. The SL1 on fire safety and radon is at page 120. The departmental response to the consultation is at page 135. Building Control Northern Ireland document is page 269, and the raised briefing paper is in 278. You're both very welcome to the Committee for Finance. We invited you to provide a briefing on the way forward for building, cladding and fire safety. And interestingly enough, probably have a few questions about radon gas as we go through, just to come to the end of it, because I must admit I hadn't expected to see that in the papers, but I'll look forward to that. So, over to you. Who's speaking? Is it going to be Billy or Damien?
I'll speak first, Chair.
Okay.
Billy here.
Yep.
So good afternoon. Damien and I are here, as you've said, to provide oral evidence to the committee in relation to proposed amendments to the Building Regulations Northern Ireland 2012 as amended on fire safety and radon matters. So firstly, just a bit about building regulations themselves. So building regulations control certain building work. They are made principally to secure the health, safety, welfare and convenience of people in and around buildings, further the conservation of fuel and power, protect and enhance the environment, and to promote sustainable development. The regulations apply to building work, typically being the erection of a new building, extension or alteration of a building, and material change of use of a building. Building regulations are only applicable at the time the building work takes place. Regulations do not apply retrospectively to existing buildings because they should comply with the regulations in force at the time when they were built. Building regulations don't impose ongoing management requirements either, such as maintenance requirements. So following public consultation on fire safety and radon proposals in local building regulations, subsequent attendance to provide evidence and deal with the queries of this committee, raised and required consultation with our local building advisory committee, known colloquially as NIBRAC. The department now proposes making the statutory rule that has been provided to the committee. It's the Building Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2022. This, along with amendments to the technical booklet guidance that supports the regulations, will affect changes in relation to the fire safety and radon matters, and a more detailed briefing is provided in the SL1 package. In relation to fire safety, the proposals will introduce a new prescriptive regulation which will require materials to be used in external walls and specified attachments such as balconies to meet a minimum performance class in terms of reaction to fire. Combustible materials cannot achieve this minimum performance class and therefore will not be permitted for use, hence the term ban on combustible materials that has come into common language. The ban will apply to buildings where the risk is perceived greatest. So it will apply to blocks of flats, sheltered housing, hospitals, care homes, nursing homes, student accommodation, all that have a storey height over 18 metres. So it's not the height of the building, it's the height of the tallest storey, the floor of the tallest storey.
In relation, Billy, just a quick one. Sir, yes. It's not going to apply to hotels, hostels and boarding houses? Why not?
We intended to follow the ban as it was already implemented in England and Wales. England have subsequently consulted on a review of that ban. where they propose to look at the threshold height of 18 metres and also widen what is known as the relevant buildings. So the classes of building I read out are termed relevant buildings, and they're looking at widening that to hotels, but they haven't published the government response yet. So we are waiting to see and keeping on to review these proposals, so that if they do move to widen the scope of the ban to, for instance, hotels, then we will rapidly as possible bring that to the local building regulations committee. And Damien may just be able to give you a particular reason why hotels at the minute weren't classed in this highest risk property.
Well, they are seen as buildings with a room for residential purposes, but they're also seen as buildings of less risk, so they tend to be well managed, subject to inspection by the Fire and Rescue Service because they're relevant premises under the Fire and Rescue Services Order 2006. They would tend to have full fire alarm systems in them. They don't have a stay put policy, a number of escape routes rather than a block of flats, which tends to be based on a single stair evacuation route. They have good signage, emergency lighting, and the statistics would indicate that the deaths in domestic residential type buildings is 3 times higher than those of other residential types with a sleeping risk, such as hotels. But that's the reason why England and Wales have left them off their scope of buildings for the ban. But as Billy says, they have consulted on that in 2020 to see if those types of buildings needed to be added to the scope of buildings for the ban.
Okay. Do we know how far they've got with that consultation?
They haven't published the results of it yet. One of the reasons why we have delayed in bringing this statutory rule forward is because of contacts with colleagues in DLUHC. They have indicated to us for the past 12 months that they would be publishing the outcomes of that consultation shortly, but they haven't gotten around to it. Right. There is a few issues in it, like the scope of buildings covered and the height threshold for the ban to apply, whether it's dropped from 18 metres currently down to 11 metres or not.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sorry, keep going, thanks. Sorry about that.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just gather myself to see where I was. The ban, sorry, IT problems here. That covers the fire safety element. In relation to radon, we're proposing to amend the regulations to refer to the latest radon in Northern Ireland indicative atlas. The Atlas of Maps is based on the most recent radon surveys, and this will be used going forward to determine the requirement for radon protective measures or not in dwellings here. So that finishes my open statement, Chair, and we welcome questions from the views of the committee.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.
Could I just make a couple of points, Chair, as well,
go ahead, Billy.
on top of that?
Yep.
The only change in these final proposals to the consultation proposals is in relation to the BS 8414 test. Mm-hmm. So the consultation proposed citing the BS 8414 test as a route to compliance for non-relevant buildings in the technical guidance. Due to the issues around the test, which are well documented and have been raised throughout the public inquiry in the Grenfell, we will now not be citing the BS 8414 test in the technical guidance at this time. Scotland withdrew reference to the same BS 8414 test from the 1st of April last year also. The other point I'd like to make is...
Sorry, but what test will we be using?
We will be using the small scale test, the linear route, so all the components of the wall have to comply with the performance classification specified in the new prescriptive regulation. So all the components, the insulation, the cladding, everything else, or what is on an exemption list, has to comply with the performance classifications of A1 or A2 S1 D0. So that will rule out the use of any non-combustible materials in relevant buildings over 18 metres.
Okay. I'm just
the other point I would like to make. Sorry,
I'm just trying to recollect. We did take evidence last year I think, and it was looking at tests, but we were specifically trying to get some evidence from at Ulster University where their team is there. I can't remember, I can't recollect what their view was on the particular test. I just wonder if one of the team can look back at that evidence.
I don't think the issue is with the actual test itself. The issue is with the gaming of the test.
Yeah, no, but they did make some reference to the test and test process, and particularly if we were going to change the test. I just think the committee it might be useful if the committee had an opportunity to refresh itself from that information. We'll take that separately, but I think I'd just like to have a quick look at that. Okay, keep going.
The other point I'd like to make is this ban that we're introducing replicates the ban that was introduced in England and Wales. So there's likely to be changes to the ban in England, and hence likely changes to the ban here going forward. So I would ask the committee not to see this as the end product on this issue of external fire spread, but rather just the first step.
Okay. So you've already explained about the business about hotels, but we've changed the difference about the tests. But you're saying that we're expecting to get more information about this, and it's evolving.
Yeah, we're expecting changes to the ban that was introduced in England at the end of 2018. Wales replicated that ban in January 2020. We're now going to replicate that, hopefully within the next month or so. But we're expecting changes to the ban in England, and I think that'll have an impact here. One of the things that they're looking at is a specific regulation that will ban the use of certain metal composite panels, which have a certain high calorific value in the core filler material. And that could possibly apply to metal composite panels used anywhere within the building or on the outside of the building.
So not just
cladding. An issue, and scope of buildings won't be an issue. It'll just be banned totally.
Okay, so not just the cladding, but might actually be within internal walls and other.
Well, the metal composite panel is cladding.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Keith. Go ahead, Keith.
Keith, you've muted yourself, I think.
Hear me now?
Yeah, we can, Keith. Yep.
Yes, I'm not. Okay. Right, can you hear me? Thank you, Damien and Billy. My question sort of relates to internal walls. Are you content that currently internal walls is satisfactory? And you talked there about metal paneling, etc. In my former life, and I'm talking 15, 20 years ago, we had to remove internal panel walls who had a filling of polystyrene or polyethylene and replace those with rock wall, whether to create, fire compartmentation or escape routes, etc. Are you content that internal walls is covered well enough currently, or do you need to go further on internal walls?
Internal walls and internal fire spread would be a separate issue to external fire spread, which is what these changes relate to. As I say, because there's specific dangerous types of products out there, such as the ACM Category 3s that was used in Grenfell. To me, if you use that within a building, it's even worse than using it on the outside of the building. So, as I say, there is plans afoot to bring in a separate regulation, and we're discussing this with our colleagues in England, Scotland and Wales, to bring in a separate regulation to ban the use of these manifestly dangerous types of products that have an inherently high calorific value to them that will contribute massively to fire spread and fire growth. So I think the Category 3 cores would cover things like polyethylene and polypropylene cores. So I think that will be the next step after this step in terms of this ban for relevant buildings only.
That actually surprises me, Damien, because it was the insurance company that insured the place I used to work at. They were the driver with this. So do you see the insurance companies, the people, and this was more so concerned with property loss instead of life loss, obviously, and obviously you needed a skip route to get people out of the building. I appreciate that, but this was more so about property loss. But do you see the industry behind the insurance world? Because I'm surprised whenever I heard of Greenville and the whole disaster that was, and the tremendous loss of life. I couldn't believe it, because we were talking about this 15 years ago.
Well, remember the building regulations set minimum standards for life safety purposes only. They're not concerned about property protection or business continuity, etc. And that's the case since building regs came in 1973. So the insurance standards can be higher standards, and they can request higher standards than standards that are set within building regulations and guidance.
So I know we're all focused on external walls, but when do you see something coming forward to remove that material or prevent that material being used on internal? Because internal, in my eyes, would have a bigger risk.
Absolutely. The polyethylene, the category 3 polyethylenes and polypropylenes of this world, I would expect to see something in relation to that later this year. Certainly in the other jurisdictions, it'll probably come before we do it, but I think it would be expected of us for to follow on and put in the same requirement.
And obviously, this is purely external. This can't be developed in our own bat to move into internal, I presume.
I think the problem is that you need to nail down the definition of what a metal composite panel is that's manifestly dangerous and unsafe to use. So you need to. It's basically based on research and evidence then as to what the calorific value should be. So what I'm hearing from colleagues in England and Scotland is that anything that's 35 megajoules per kilogram and over, which would cover the category 3 polyethylenes and polypropylenes, that's the type of substance that they're looking to ban. But possibly later this year, certainly early next year, for something along those lines.
I welcome this in front of us, but I don't think it goes far enough. And I appreciate it's external, and we can't muddy up between external and internal. But I think it concerns me that the internals, obviously we talk about spread of flame and all those issues. I don't think it goes far enough. I appreciate it's only external, but we'll leave it there, Chair, and thank you, Damien and Billy.
Okay. Any other members? Okay. Just a quick one, Billy. You said about the radon information. How many new houses will require preventative measures? Because I think somewhere in the documentation it says about 7,000 new houses that were built per annum. I don't think we built 7,000 houses in Northern Ireland per annum. So is that the case, or is it based on other data?
Yeah, well, that's in the regulatory impact assessment, Chair, my understanding of that. But if it needs clarified, we'll do that for you, is that there's roughly 7,000 new builds a year. Now, the new maps will take an increased proportion of those new builds into account, so there'll be more of those new builds in a radon-affected area. And you look at those maps and then determine if it's in a radon-affected area, what is the level of protection that you need to put in? Is it simply just a membrane, or do you need to put additional ducts and ventilation in the subfloor? So you don't need to do it for every building. So to give you an example, I live in Newton Abbey on Kermoney Hill, and I looked at the old maps and I wasn't in a radon-affected area. I looked at the new maps and I was, but then to get more detail, and there's more detail in these new maps, I was able to pay £4 and discover that I wasn't in a radon-affected area. So first of all, you have to determine if in your radon-affected area, and the idea here is that we always had to provide this as scientific evidence, that we couldn't just simply say, we'll just put this into every home, because there was no scientific evidence. And you mentioned JRing earlier on, and the point is, if we don't base specific building regulations measures on scientific evidence, we are then at risk of that policy, because that would be a blanket increase across the board to all dwellings, and not just those that the scientific evidence would point to need to have these specific measures put in place.
That's just an interesting. So, if the radon maps, have they recently been updated?
Yes. Well, they were updated. We have been using the radon maps unofficially, so they're not actually. We are updating to the new new 2015 maps, but we have been using those as a trial period because we agreed with the council's building control, and we issued an information note whereby we would use those maps. But we're taking this opportunity because we were creating an SR specifically for the ban on combustible materials, that we would do some administrative work and get the regulations up to date. But effectively, we have been using the latest maps, but we're just putting that on a legal footing by changing the reference in the regulations.
Okay. And are we doing something about sort of improving public knowledge of radon now that the maps have been updated?
Well, we have, we normally, when we do these sorts of things, we do information sessions with the councils. And often they're open to the public as well. The difficulty is with the current pandemic is that we can't hold town hall events, but we will certainly look at that if you think that's a good idea and see how we can increase awareness of this.
Declaration of interest. If you're a constituent of mine, I'll go down to Mossley Mill and make sure I get my maps updated so I understand where the radon is.
Yes, certainly. Good idea.
Okay, team. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, team. Is the committee content with the policy intention of the SL1, and is it content for the department to make the rule? Just in the evidence session, we said they're considering updates, and there's various other updates that are likely to come through about hotels and other pieces of legislation as legislation's coming through as well. Look, I don't want to stop this, but I think it must be something that we need to be kept informed as soon as the changes are coming in. And I think that would be appropriate if we wrote to the department to say, if we are content for this one.
Yeah,
we are. Policy, about to keep us updated, particularly because he said 3 or 4 times that things are changing to be able to do that. Keith, go ahead. Keith.
Hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Yeah, just follow on from that. I think it'd be important if the committee was happy to write to and just confirm what's happening with the internal walls. That would concern me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it's not coming tomorrow or in a week or two, but just to keep the pressure on, because the internal walls is as big an issue as external.
Okay. Thanks, Keith. Okay. Content? Great. Thank you. Move on, team, to agenda number 10, Statute Rule 2217, making a laying of different rates. Clerk's briefing notes page 295, the Statute Rule 2022-17 at page 296. At our meeting on the 19th of January, the committee considered the SL1 for the statutory rule. The committee agreed that it was content with the policy objectives. The purpose of the statutory rule is to allow the inclusion of the conversion factors table on a non-mandatory basis. This will allow the factors to be referenced in the annual calculation of the rate support grant, which is made by the Department for Communities. The Department for Finance has no policy role in relation to that grant. The request for the rule came from a district council. The proposed rule will be subject to negative resolution procedure. Any comments? Therefore, members, if we're content, the committee has considered Statutory Rule 2022-17, the rate, making and levying of different rates, regulations Northern Ireland 2022, and subject to the report of the examiner's statutory rules, has no objection to this rule. Is this agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Moving on to the next item, Statutory Rule 2213, date of rate setting. Members, the following papers, Peter's briefing paper is page 304, Statutory Rule 2022-13 is at page 305. At our meeting on the 5th of January, we considered the SL1 for the statutory rule. The committee agreed that it was content with the policy objectives. The purpose of the statutory rule is to amend the date by which a district council must make the district rate for a forthcoming rating year from the 1st of March to the 15th of February. This is a return to the pre-pandemic practice and is being adopted following advice from Solace. The rule will be subject to negative resolution procedure. Any comments? Are we content? Therefore, the committee has considered Statutory Rule 2022-13, the Rate Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2022, and subject to the report of the examiner, statutory rules has no objection to this rule. Are we agreed? Agreed. Next item on the agenda, SL1, Death Certification and Registration. The Department of Finance proposes to make a statutory rule under powers conferred by the Coronavirus Act 2020. In the event of a death prior to the pandemic, informants were required to attend in person the registration office in respect of stillbirths or deaths, obtain and provide a medical certificate of cause of death, sign the register and provide a form to the funeral director. The rule extends those provisions which allows for registration by telephone and the provision of documentation electronically. The rule will also continue to waive the requirement for a medical practitioner to notify the coroner when the death is by natural causes and the doctor has not seen the deceased within the previous 28 days. The proposed rule will extend these provisions until the 24th of September 2022. The Health Minister has expressed some concerns in respect of the continued waiving of the 28-day rule in respect of medical practitioners advising the coroner. And we also understand the Justice Minister? Yes. Yeah. And the Justice Minister as well, but we don't have the specific details on that as well. There's been no formal consultation with the Department, but the Department has referred to positive feedback from stakeholders. I would have thought the Minister for Health and the Minister for Justice were fairly important stakeholders in this process. Similar provisions appear to be in effect in the rest of the United Kingdom. The proposed rule will be subject to draft affirmative resolution procedures. Members, do we have any comments? I think I would probably like to ascertain what specifically the Minister for Health and the Minister for Justice concerns are about this before we proceeded with this. And bearing in mind, thankfully, we seem to be easing out of the worst part of the pandemic. I would like to have that information in front of me before we were content to make any further comment on this SL1.
Agreed.
Are we agreed? Thank you. Next item, correspondence. Correspondence index. 9 items received correspondence on page 318. First up, RHI disciplinary process. The committee is asked to consider at page 320 a ministerial response to the committee queries re the RHI disciplinary process. The Minister indicates that he will not provide further unredacted papers. He provides some information on the fact-finding review for the Cabinet Office disciplinary process. The Minister confirms that neither he nor the Executive signed off on the adapted RHI disciplinary process. So just to be confirmed, the Civil Service set their disciplinary process through the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board, where 2 members who were potentially being investigated had recused themselves from the board, but they didn't get either the executive or ministerial write-off for this process.
That is apparently what the correspondence says, Chair.
Nice, cosy in-house arrangement.
I don't think that, to say the least, is in any way satisfactory. Does any other member think it is satisfactory? No.
Chair, can I comment on the 2 permanent secretaries, Sterling and McCormick, and Sir Jonathan Jones's role? So he was asked to conduct a fact-finding review, and he did that obviously by reviewing what the RHI inquiry report said, and then he gave both of them an opportunity to provide evidence and make representations about those findings. It's not stated, but I'm inferring that was in writing, but we don't know that. And then he presented such facts as he found, and the Cabinet Secretary, who was the decision maker, decided no charge of gross misconduct, but the disciplinary hearings would be held to determine allegations of misconduct.
Yes.
So there must have been then hearings on misconduct, but all we're told is that at the conclusion, the Cabinet Secretary did not uphold the charges of misconduct. You know, we've no knowledge, well, who, in terms prosecuted, how were these processes conducted, were the 2 gentlemen present, were they legally represented, was there any representation of any case against them? You know, it's very unsatisfactory.
I think, as from our friend from North Antrim, is anybody else who thinks this was a satisfactory process? I think there's two things we need to think about this as well. This, obviously, I think it might be worthy asking further questions, because it's not a question of whether it's redacted or unredacted. We should be asking whether this process, who actually conducted this misconduct, or whatever. What's the language you use, Jim?
To determine allegations of misconduct. The problem for us in that is that had no Northern Ireland involvement.
Correct.
That was simply the Cabinet Secretary and whatever Sir Jonathan Jones provided them. So there was no... So, like, even our Finance Minister won't effectively know anything about that.
No. But I think it's worthy of... I think it's something that's worthy of consideration. Tim, in the 2 years we've been here, the RHI process has rolled through this committee at various degrees, at various stages. And what we as a committee have been trying to do is to ascertain whether the lessons that have been identified of RHI have actually been acted upon. And every time we've asked a question or tried to see it, we've never really got any sort of detailed information about the reforms that have been necessary, have actually been conducted. Every time we have had to drag information, and I'm not blaming the Minister actually, I think the Minister has been badly served because he hasn't been given the information that he needs. I think we're in a position within this committee, before the end of our term, is actually to collate this information together of what we have received about RHI and make some observations, I think, would be appropriate. Because, you know, if we don't come back from after the election period for a considerable period of time, a lot of what we have discovered has to be enacted upon, and people need to be aware of the situation that we're in.
Couldn't that be part of the legacy report?
Good. Yeah. So I think, and again, with your support, committee, I would like us to probably do a piece of work of bringing this information together, and so in a position where maybe we can bring it in front of the Assembly before we complete, and give people an opportunity to discuss it. If we were in agreement? Agreement?
Is that agreed?
Yes. Is that agreed? Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So, Chair, there is some correspondence still in the air from the departments. If you recall, it's not from the department, the Hawks, the committee wrote to Hawks asking about there's some kind of review, which they had commissioned. I remember Philip McGuigan raised the question, so they haven't come back to us just yet. So I think when we get that, then everything will have landed then that's probably going to land.
Well, there is the suggestion in this letter that officials might come and talk to us, but they couldn't talk to us about the permanent secretaries. Because they don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But do we want to hear from them nonetheless? I don't know.
Take the information and you could decide what you want to do. So you could have a further briefing, or you could go to a motion before the Assembly.
I think I would quite like to bring a motion before the Assembly, because look, we can get officials and come in front of us, but what more are we going to get from it? I think a motion in front of the Assembly would be useful, because bearing in mind, you know, most of the Assembly term was down because of RHI and the implications of it. And I think we've done a lot of work of discovery. I'm not sure that we've managed to progress the reform process further, but I think it would be useful if we had a motion in front of the Assembly to be able to discuss it, if we were in agreement. Sorry, Gemma?
What would you be asking the motion? What would the text of the motion be? Like, what outcome are you looking for?
Enough steam, I suspect.
Perhaps you might want to wait until all of the bits of paper land. I'll bring it all back. You can see what's there, and we'll see how the committee feels about the RHI action plan, and also about the RHI disciplinary process, and sort of those two bits. Because I mentioned the action plan because you can talk quite a bit about that, because there's quite a lot of documents in the public domain. The other stuff on the RHI disciplinary process, I think we find it quite difficult to put that into the public domain, and members don't want to do that inappropriately. So maybe I'll put it together, come back, maybe when we're clear of the budget stuff, which will be in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, and then committee can make up its mind.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're not going to get ourselves into the position where sort of the redacted and but the fact that a disciplinary process was established which the Minister says he wasn't involved in, the Executive wasn't involved in, and it was the Board of the Northern Ireland Civil Service marking the Northern Ireland Civil Service. I mean, if that is not a matter of public interest and a matter that the Assembly should be aware of, I'm not quite sure what is. But I think that's probably one of the most fundamental things that has arisen that we need to have a look at. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next item, something completely uncontroversial, the Queen's Jubilee tree planting. The committee is asked to note at page 325 a ministerial response indicating the Minister's view that the Stormont Estate policy is excessively prohibitive and that the Department is to review the policy and carry out an audit in respect of the use of the Stormont Estate. This is to be complete by the end of February. Any comments?
Chair, I would say it's quite clear the policy as implemented by the Minister is an unsustainable position. I think he misapplied it in that the event of the Jubilee is an international event, but if this is about saving blushes and getting to the right result in the end, then maybe it's progress, but let's see.
Are we content to note the correspondence?
No, Mr. Chairman, I was
Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
that the policy will be referred back to us for consideration as a committee. But when he hopefully does amend it to allow the tree planting for Her Majesty's 70th anniversary on the throne, couldn't be more international. The point I made the last time is she's head of state of at least 30 countries. So how more international can you get than that?
Okay. Keith. Thank you. Oh, Keith, go ahead.
You can hear me okay?
Yep.
Can we request a copy of the request that was made to the Department of Finance? Or maybe we've already had that in the pack. I didn't see that. Did we ever get a copy of that actual request?
Didn't ask for it.
You didn't ask for it.
Or the reply.
Can we ask?
Yes.
It is agreed. And Melissa?
Yeah, Melissa, go ahead.
And just to clarify as well, Chair, that under the current policy is something that actually can't be done, and that the Minister stated himself is quite happy to review that policy and has stated here that hopefully by the end of February we'll have clarity on that issue.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next item.
Chair,
right, go ahead,
just for clarity, can we request a copy of that request from the Green Canopy Initiative?
Yes, we asked that. Oh, for the Green Canopy Initiative?
Yep.
Yes, we did. That's agreed.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on to the next item of correspondence, SIB secondments.
Sorry, just before you leave that. In terms of asking for the review, are there any terms of reference for that review?
Ask the C term.
Is it formal, or is it a largely informal thing? I think
we can ask for the terms of reference and ask how those be considered.
Is that agreed, Chairperson?
Is that agreed? Agreed.
Yep.
Good. Thank you. Right, can we do the Investment Board now? Okay. Next is Strategic Investment Board secondments. The committee is asked to note at page 329 a ministerial response in respect of the 59 SIB secondments to the Northern Ireland Civil Service. And we also noticed today that they're doing training as well. Strategic Investment Board, didn't we have evidence earlier on that they're doing a training on procurement?
Yep, it did.
To be clear, Chair, it's not 59 to NICS, it's Senate to NICS, etc. So that includes the councils, there are 10 and 10 in the wider public sector, so it's 39 to the NICS. Sorry, there you go.
So I think one of the questions that raises to me is sort of what grades are these people that they're providing? Are they senior staff? Are they junior staff? What's their pay banding that they are? Bearing in mind we've already had the example of the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service who wasn't a civil servant, seconded in from the SIB. I think I would quite like to get a better idea of that. And I realise that the SIB comes under the remit of the Executive Office, but a lot of the discussions we have on sort of issues of procurement and the rest of it, and also in civil service reform, all seem to be centred around the SIB. And I think one of the questions I think we must be getting to the point soon is when do we have the SIB to come and discuss these issues with the committee? Because their remit seems to be the catch. It's a bit like our own department. Their remit seems to be the catch-all for everything that everybody else doesn't have. But I just think that's interesting. But I think I would like the committee, if, with your agreement, first of all, to note the correspondence, but also ask the question about the grades and what their sort of grades and sort of their salary bands are. Because if this is providing senior staff to the civil service, and where's their role and where they're controlled by as well. And maybe one of the things we might consider is, if we've got any time before the end, maybe asking SIB to come and talk to us about sort of the various areas that they're involved in, including procurement and other issues, because we haven't had a chance to talk to them.
Yeah, agreed. Chair, could I make two comments? I think there's two important things here. One is that these are people filling, I suspect, very significant roles, other than through a regular recruitment process. And secondly, filling roles in which the accountability issue is at best opaque. Who are they accountable to? You know, you take those embedded in councils. Are they accountable to the council? Are they accountable to SIB? Likewise, in the civil service, where they aren't subject to the civil service code or discipline or any of that. Yeah. I think it's not the most healthy situation, I think.
Okay. If we're content, move on to the next item, Northern Ireland Investment Fund. The committee has asked to note on page 346 departmental correspondence providing further information setting out the financial transaction capital used by the Northern Ireland Investment Fund. £75 million is set out. Around £24 million has been returned. The department appears to indicate that further announcements may be made in respect to the remaining approximately £30 million. Are we content to note the correspondence and hopefully we do actually get some of this money spent? Great. Next item, 13.6, the Crown Estate. The committee is asked to note at page 351 a departmental response advising the committee that the Crown Estate raises around 1.7 million per annum, but its management is reserved. Are we content to note this correspondence? Content. Next one, RHI closure. The committee is asked to consider at page 357 a departmental response on RHI closure, indicating that payments are to continue as is, and that closure is a policy matter for the Department for Economy, and that Treasury has not confirmed that will roll the closure payments over to 22-23. This is £91 million, isn't it? So this is a significant amount of money, but this is ring-fence resource Dale or something, some peculiar sort of.
It's money we're not spending by and large. We're not spending it because the tariffs have been reduced so low. So I think a good part of that money is going back each year.
Yeah, well, I think what they're saying is that the Treasury has not confirmed that it will allow it to be rolled over. So the Treasurer probably said, no, you're not getting it. I think we need to get some clarity in this issue. And are we content to write to the Department for the Economy, the Economy Committee, seeking clarity in this issue? Because I think that's something that would be of some interest. Okay, agreed? Agreed. Okay, next item, draft budget 22-25. The committee is asked to consider at page 359 a response from the Committee for the Economy, providing papers setting out the Department for Economy 22-25 budget pressures. I think that was actually quite a good paper that came through. Is the committee content to note this correspondence and add it to the Finance Committee report on the draft budget for consideration on the 23rd of February? Agreed? Agreed. Right. Non-ACM cladding claims. The committee is asked to note at page 379 a response from the Department for Communities to committee queries re non-ACM cladding. The Department for Communities indicates Department of Finance provided the details of the 11 claims. The Department for Communities had not provided any clarity on their likely costs or if the Northern Ireland Housing Executive is to undertake the repairs. Any commentary? Okay, are we content to note?
Note.
Great. Okay. So our declaration of interest, this letter refers to a small and successful business in my constituency. The committee is asked to consider...
Can I just declare not to stare to you and that I've been lobbied on the same issue?
All right, okay. The committee is asked to consider at page 385 and at page 54 of tabled items correspondence from a concerned owner of soft play business indicating that he is not eligible for the current COVID hospitality payments. In the briefing we received from RAISE, there was an interesting piece on the amount of money that the department had allocated to soft play areas. I think previously.
That was previously, yes.
Yeah, previously. Yeah.
This is different. The current Omicron was for hospitality, and his argument is he's on Junction 1. McDonald's is doing a rare treat, believe me it is, but he isn't, so that and he's not eligible for any of these support packages, is what he says.
And nothing from, obviously, from the Department for Economy?
That is what he indicates. So we could write to our own department just seeking clarity on this category of business, because I think there were certainly something happening with hotels and other things, I think, so, and sports clubs. So maybe there's something here.
Okay. Can we write to, if we're agreed, can we write to the department to ask for clarity on this category of business?
Agreed.
Okay. Go. Second LCM public sector pensions. The committee is asked to consider at page 56 tabled items correspondence from the department replying to committee queries regarding the second LCM and public sector pensions. Are we content to note? Noted. Composite information request. Members are asked to consider the composite information request at page 387. Are we content to note? Agreed. Moving on to the forward work programme. The draft forward work programme is page 406. Are we content with the forward work programme as drafted? Agreed. Any other business?
Or forever hold your peace.
Agreed. Right. Okay, the next meeting will be in here at 1400 on Wednesday, the 9th of February. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for a good...
Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed.